Ladies and gentlemen, it is April 21st, 2024, and we are here to talk about the world, current events, foreign policy, economics, you name it. We'll talk about it live with Agent Smith. Smith.
Hello.
Yo.
Hey, how are you?
Pretty good. Chillin'. Video gaming, talking about psytrance, which is an interesting music genre that has its influences from India, cool enough as that may be.
I'm guessing Goa.
Yeah. Goa, India. They bring their own subgenre of psytrance. It's called Goa trance. And it's usually very upbeat. They've got like Indian sounding melodies and also instruments and voices with the high beats per minute techno sounds. So it's pretty cool. I like it. Ends up being a good music genre to listen to while playing StarCraft because it keeps you going and motivated, but it's also usually kind of tranquil and calming, like you're on a spirit journey or something.
Sounds like something hippies would make.
Yes, exactly. Kukyo and I enjoyed it a good deal during situations where we may have been less than our most sober selves.
Pretty ironic considering the history of violence in Goa. It was settled by the Portuguese, and they held on to it all the way until the 1950s.
Wow, the 50s? So that would have been when... did Britain let go of India? And
India got its independence from Britain in, I want to say, 47.
Okay, so pretty close in time then.
Yeah, it's about 10 years roughly. But they tried to keep it. But Portugal was not in a position to deny India. Mm-hmm. And India was definitely claiming it.
It would be very hard for them to defend.
Yeah.
India has a lot of people, so if they just run at it, it's like, what are you going to do?
That's pretty much what they did. I mean, they massed, the Indian army outside of the territory and then issued demands for it. And then Indian protesters, I guess, if you want to call them that, started just walking into the territory, basically breaching the border. And, the colonial garrison in Goa didn't really know how to handle it. Because obviously if they open fire, that's kind of a casus belli for the Indian army. But if they don't do anything, then the sovereignty of the territory is being violated. Mm. So eventually the Portuguese government just caved in and said, fine, you can have it. We'll just hand it over. And it was done at that point fairly peacefully. But back in the day, the Portuguese went pretty hard there because they had it when they were going through their Inquisition, 1500s, 1600s, etc. And so a lot of the locals were subjected to that. Not any more fun in India than it was in Europe.
Did Portugal have an Inquisition separate from the Spanish, or was it all the same thing?
Yeah, it overlapped. It was very similar, largely the same genesis. They did it in much the same way, torture, forced confessions, etc. Mm-hmm. But yeah, it was run separately, if that's what you mean. Mm-hmm. And so much as it was different government authorities responsible for it.
It's interesting that you kind of think about it like a strat where they can get rid of undesirables at the time, because it's currently an objective of the church to try to weed out disloyal. So you're going to have some administrative churn and then capitalize on that if you want to. Kind of makes me think of how witch hunts tend to go. Like when you inquisition someone, like, are you really looking at their closeness of practicing the faith? And then why are you administering punishment so harshly? It's just a really weird period of aggressive social pressure of making sure people are a certain way.
Well, institutions are machines, right? So, while we can kind of debate and discuss the genesis of things like that, once it starts, it takes on a life of its own. Mm-hmm. So, if you're the church or if you're whatever kind of constabulatory authority responsible for actually implementing the policies behind the Inquisition. You're pretty much just doing it for the paycheck, right? You know, if you don't do it, you get in trouble, so you just kind of go in, and whether you really believe in the cause or not, you have to do it. So you just kind of phone it in, do it, and it's sort of your day job. It can be very mundane after a while. Yeah, I remember reading about the memories of a political prisoner in Iran who was talking about her torture, which is, you know, not unusual, especially for political prisoners in Iran's prison system. And one of the things that kind of stuck out to me, and that also stuck out to her, which is why she remembered it, was there was one point during her torture when the guy torturing her had to take a break because he'd gotten a phone call from his wife. And she could actually hear them talking. And the wife was upset because he said that he would be working late again. And so she got mad at him and, you know, basically just demanded that he come home early. And so they had an argument about it. So it stood out to her just how mundane the job could be. Like, you know, just in terms of work-life balance and that side of the job, like it wasn't really that much different than any other job. So, you know, when you think of people torturing political prisoners, you know, you should not think of them as necessarily being ideologically driven people who are doing it because they passionately hate the people they're torturing or who believe in whatever the cause is in the name of which that they're doing the torturing. A lot of them are just doing it because it's what they're paid to do. It's just a 9-to-5 job.
Nothing against you guys. It's my job here.
Yeah, for a lot of people, that's what it is. Like, they don't really care all that much. So I imagine pretty similar with the Inquisition. You know, certainly there were religious fanatics who firmly believed in it. But if you're just like one of the regular guys doing the torturing, just something else to do, pretty much.
Heckin' weird. I'm glad we don't do that on a systematic level anymore. We probably still torture people in some contexts, but very barbarous times, I will tell you.
It depends where you live.
Yeah.
Yeah, some places have not moved beyond it. And hey, some places are re-embracing it. Even some places that gave it up are kind of rediscovering the value of torture. even all these years later. What's old is new again. Unfortunately, that can be as true for barbaric acts as for anything else. But yeah, Goa definitely had its share of that back in the day. And there's still a substantive Catholic population in Goa to this day, which is a residual effect of that. It's also one of the, well, Goa is known in India as a place where you can buy lots of alcohol because the regulations are relatively loose there. That's partly to do with the fact that it's a major tourist location. You know, obviously they make a lot of money from that, which, you know, is part of the reason that this genre of music you were talking about originated there. You know, there's kind of a big party scene in Goa for the benefit of tourists and whatnot. So, you know, loose regulations regarding alcohol are part and parcel of that because obviously you want all the party people coming to, you know, be able to get loaded and have fun and whatnot. But it also has to do with the fact that Christian rules and regulations about alcohol are a little bit looser than for, say, Islam.
Yeah, for sure.
Or for certain strains of Hinduism. I don't know that there's anything inherent in Hinduism that requires alcohol to be regulated, but when the British were running the country, they did that. You know, they regulated it relatively more than they had before, and so some of that ended up creeping into the culture of the broader country, even though it wasn't indigenous to the country. But while the British were doing that, the Portuguese were still running Goa, and they didn't really give a shit. So law is a little bit different in that regard.
Well, I read a little bit more in American nations. I haven't
Oh,
made
cool.
a ton of progress on that, but it is one of my goals to complete it someday. Slow going as my reading time may be. But it's interesting to see how the different regions involved had very different kinds of levels of combat and rebellion relative to each other, just because the British weren't able to project force equally in all those regions. Like in a lot of regions, say for the Scots who were there, they just took it as an opportunity to like fight shit because they were good at that. They're like, oh, there's a conflict. Okay, well, we're just gonna pick the opposite side of your side because fuck you. So they're just using this as an opportunity to kind of get more power if they can, and then some people like deep south, a lot of them were not really that interested either way. It was just sort of, okay, who's gonna restrict us less and let us do our shit, kind of an attitude, rather than the Yankees who are the ones who are the most so like, are you a patriot? Are you actually for the cause? Are you trying to build the best country in the world? That kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah, it varied pretty considerably based off geography. You know, a lot of it was, as you say, you know, sort of these regional rivalries playing out, or even intra-regional class rivalries playing out. And correspondingly, there was a lot of variance there. You know, I don't know how far you've made it in the chapter, but like it was notable to me that a lot of the Scots-Irish peoples living up in the hill country varied considerably in their loyalties. You know, basically they just fought whoever was on their shit list, you know, in their given area, and sometimes that would include each other. You know, I thought it was pretty interesting how Scots-Irish families, well, the Scots-Irish areas would generally have a few like well-off families, relatively speaking, that would kind of dominate the area, and then there would be sort of more peripheral families and groups that would be on the margin. And one of the things that happened is that sort of the more well-established folks and the less established folks ended up fighting against each other in the war, especially in the South. And so there was kind of a class context to the Scots-Irish experience during the Revolutionary War as a result.
Interesting.
It was extremely violent. Like they just about cleared out the hill country in the South because it was so violent. But it wasn't like there was no front line per se. Like it really was a civil war there, where they were just sort of raiding each other's territory, you know, killing people, etc. You know, a lot of refugees, and a lot of refugees resulted, and a lot of communities ended up hollowed out or destroyed. You know, to the point where there was a very long recovery afterwards that inevitably ensued.
Revolution was way more messy and fragmented than the stories make you think.
Yeah, very much so. But that also makes it more interesting too.
Yeah.
You know, it was already pretty interesting, but it's even more interesting when you start learning about all these little nuances that get overlooked. So yeah, there's definitely quite a bit to chew on. Yeah, you'll have to tell me what you think as you kind of move through the Revolutionary War period described in the book.
Will do. Yeah, it also kind of highlights the difference too between when we declared independence versus when we actually won independence. Because you can say, we're an independent country, fuck you. But that doesn't make you a sovereign nation recognized by the rest of the countries in the world. You're like still yet to prove that you defend your own territory, kind of a thing.
Yeah.
And you declare yourself. So 1776, Declaration of Independence, but that's when a lot of the fighting was still really hot. So it wasn't really a done deal.
Yeah, there's still a lot of debate about that. Yeah, they weren't entirely sure like a full break with the mother country was necessarily in their best interest. But eventually they did pull the trigger. But yeah, like you say, you know, it was not inevitable that they would win out. It definitely took a considerable amount of time for them to finally reach a point where they could actually force the British to the table and get them to recognize their independence. Thanks to the French for helping us out with that.
Yeah. The French did some like naval blockade or something.
I mean, a lot of the support they gave was in the form of like weapons, ammunition, and financial aid for most of the war, which was very important. But later on, near the end, they actually finally did land some troops, and their navy did attempt to try to intercede into the waters around the coastal waters around the United States, or the colonies as they were at the time. The trouble that the French Navy had is that the British Navy was just sort of bigger and better in a lot of ways. And actually, much to the chagrin of the revolutionaries in the mainland in North America, a lot of the French war effort was actually focused more in the Caribbean, because that's where the most valuable shit was. You could get a lot of tax revenue out of the trade in things like sugar, for example. And so all these big sugar-producing islands in the Caribbean were very attractive targets. And so the British and French navies fought a pretty considerable battle for control of the Caribbean and for the various wealthy islands therein. North America was kind of a sideshow in that sense. And so, the revolutionaries asked the French government to, could you please send us some more support? The fighting is very tough going. And it wasn't until like the early, I think, 1780s when they finally started doing that. And it was the French Navy that blockaded the Chesapeake, specifically the Chesapeake Bay, and more specifically Yorktown, where the revolutionaries managed to bottle up an entire British army, pretty much the army that was responsible for the South at that point. The revolutionaries had managed to kind of maneuver them into a corner. The British didn't really, specifically the British general in charge of that army, didn't really think he was in a lot of danger. We kind of assumed that if worst came to worst, then the Royal Navy could bail him out. But as it happened, the French Navy was able to push them out and gain control of the Chesapeake. And so he was put in an impossible situation where he was blockaded by sea and surrounded on land. And at that point, he had to surrender. And so that was a pretty nasty blow as far as the British position in the Americas. They pretty much had to give up the South at that point, and it was pretty clear to everybody that they were on the way out by that point. The war had been prolonged. It was very expensive. Having to fight all these other major countries like they were at that point was very distracting and also very expensive. So the British government at that point just kind of conceded the point. Like it's easier just to give them independence than it is to continue to litigate this issue. And that led directly to the peace negotiations. Yeah, the French Navy was never particularly confident about their position in the Chesapeake or in North America generally. That was one of the reasons they've been reluctant to commit. Like even when they were, blockading Yorktown, they were perpetually concerned that the Royal Navy would return and would basically eject them because they didn't really think they could win. So in a sense, we're pretty lucky that the Royal Navy happened to be out to lunch at the time. Maybe it would have been different otherwise.
Alas.
Well, they can't complain too much, Neuro. They did get to keep Canada.
And they're still in the money to this day. Yeah. And so we have the United States in current year. I can't believe we're getting a Trump versus Biden matchup. As a person, this disappoints me. We have a lot of excellent people in this country.
Well, that's just kind of the political moment, right? The populists versus...
It's not a good moment.
Granted, I don't disagree with you on that, but if we are going to have populists versus establishmentarianism, the populist invariably are going to go Trump because he's like the populist candidate, and also he's won before, which is a major feather in his cap relative to other rivals. And if you're an establishmentarian, then you're in a very, very large coalition that has many, many different groups with a lot of different preferences. So it's inevitable that whatever candidate you have is going to be a unity candidate who doesn't defend anybody in the coalition, but is sufficiently appealing to win their support. So invariably, that's going to be a bland candidate.
It's like the super average risk-averse blob of you try to upset as few people as possible, which in a sense is a good thing, but it also means that nothing really defines you either, which is why it's hard to hate Biden ideologically, because his ideology is just go with the safe bet that has worked before. He doesn't really do anything adventurous in terms of policy. He also doesn't like push any propaganda of his own, I feel like. I don't watch a ton of what he says, though, so maybe some people know better than me, but he seems very teleprompter as a candidate. He does what the teleprompter tells him to. He's not going to go wild, and then Trump is the complete opposite of that. So this is like the axis that we are voting on now, is how risk-seeking versus risk-averse, how inhibited versus how just ridiculous you want your candidate to be. And it's not really about the issues, it's about the personalities.
Yeah, unfortunately so. You know, voting based off of personality rather than issues is a characteristic of a lot of developing countries. So not great to see it here, but, you know, it's not as though we haven't seen it here before. We have had populist eras of American politics before. And given how much latent pent-up demand there was for a lot of change in the United States of one kind or another, maybe it was inevitable that we would have another such populist period. So here we are in the middle of it, in the eye of the storm.
What was the other populist period?
We had a big one. Well, you could argue we had one in the early 20th century that kind of depends on your opinion of FDR and progressivism. But indisputable is that we had one in the late 19th century. And that was the era of William Jennings Bryan, you know, the era of free silver. What were they called? There was a movement of agricultural populists. I don't remember their name off the top of my head. But there was a kind of agricultural populism that took off at the same time that there was a kind of urban anti-corruption populism that evolved into what would later be known as progressivism. And there was also a lot of racism. I don't know that I would call racist, you know, populist per se, but populism in the American South in the late 19th century overlapped with agricultural populism, because obviously agriculture was like the industry in the South at the time. But racism was also a major part of it, you know, because of course in the wake of the Civil War there was a sense that black people could become equal to white people, and that the federal government was trying to impose equality on the region. And of course, a lot of people in the South really, really hated that. And so part of populism in the South was actually resisting that push towards equality and trying to reaffirm racial inequality, be it informal or explicitly legal, as eventually became the case after Plessy v. Ferguson. So, you know, all of that kind of differed in manifestation by region. You know, in the South, it was kind of racist and anti-Reconstruction. In the Midwest and in the West, it was more agricultural populism. And in the major urban centers in the Northeast, as well as to a degree in the Midwest, it was more progressive, as we would call it now. But it was definitely there. Populism was a major force, and, you know, establishment elites were definitely very worried about it. You know Wizard of Oz, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So did you know that the book that it's based on was actually coded commentary on the populist movement of the late 1800s?
I did not know that.
Yeah, so the Yellow Brick Road was a reference to gold, and then the witch's silver shoes. Am I remembering this right? It was the shoes, I think, that were silver. No, other way around. I think it was the road that was actually silver in the original book. That's what it was. And I think the witch's shoes were gold. Something like that. I don't remember the details. But it was all commentary on the populist debate in the late 1800s that silver coinage was the future. You know, they needed to move away from gold. Because one of the things that happened in the 1870s is that the bimetallic standard that the U.S. was on, which officially recognized both gold coinage and silver coinage as being legal tender in the United States was changed so that only gold coinage was legal tender. And a lot of people were very upset about that because it ended up, devaluing gold, created a big financial panic. It was a whole clusterfuck. And it took a while, but eventually, like 10, 20 years later, people started thinking of that as a conspiracy theory that was designed to impoverish farmers. The thinking was that there would be more inflation if silver was brought back. And so by, removing silver, it created deflation. So if you owe a lot of money, you actually kind of like inflation because that actually makes the loan that you owe less valuable and therefore easier to pay off over time.
Ah, that makes sense.
So the populists wanted more inflation, and so they wanted the reintroduction of silver coinage as legal tender. And so that was the whole rallying cry of free silver. We want silver back in the economy as legal tender. And they started to think of the change in the 1870s as a conspiracy theory to try to impoverish the farmer and enrich the banks, who they saw as being the prime beneficiaries of that. So that whole era was, a major movement, and it was one of the precursors to the rise of sort of left-wing / socialist movements in the early 20th century, because a lot of progressivism had its roots in the success of the populist movement in the late 19th century. People like Theodore Roosevelt, for example, one of the most popular presidents in American history. A lot of his popularity was predicated on his popularity amongst both urban progressives and the agricultural populists. He was able to dual hat that to great effect, and results speak for themselves. Again, he's remembered as one of the most popular, effective presidents in the history of the country.
So cool that he got shot in the middle of his speech and then finished his speech. It's like the polar opposite of where we're at for our presidents right now.
Oh, God. Can you imagine?
Oh, jeez. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think Trump or Biden would be able to pull that off.
Nope.
Yeah, Roosevelt was such a character. He stepped down as president. He let his vice president run and win. But then when his former vice president ran for a second term, he actually ran against him because he didn't like what he was doing as president. And so he started a whole new party, the Bull Moose Party, as his personal vehicle to try to win the presidency. And he did okay, but it didn't ultimately work out. And because he split the ticket for the Republicans, Woodrow Wilson was able to win. And so that's actually how he became president.
Because Woodrow Wilson was president, he was vice president, but then he died?
No, because during the presidential election in 1912, I want to say, the first one in which Woodrow Wilson was running for president, Taft was running for the Republican ticket. Well, he was the Republican nominee running for president. And then at the same time, Theodore Roosevelt was running as a third-party candidate under the Bull Moose Party. And basically, Roosevelt took more votes from the Republicans than he did from the Democrats. And so the Republican right-wing vote was split between Roosevelt and Taft. And because we have a first-past-the-post system, Wilson basically won by default.
That makes sense.
So if not for that, Wilson might not have been president, which may or may not have been a good thing, depending on your politics. Certainly a lot of people now hate Wilson on both the left and right for a variety of reasons.
Why did they hate Wilson? What did he do?
Well, conservatives don't like him because he introduced the income tax, the federal income tax, which was nominally justified as a temporary measure to fund World War I and the American expenses in World War I, and then just became permanent. So people blame him for that. Isolationists blamed him for getting the United States involved in World War I, which of course they were very opposed to. A lot of people didn't like him because of the Sedition Act, which basically made it a crime, to vocally express views against the involvement of the United States in the war. So a lot of people were arrested corresponding to that. And a lot of
Wait,
people
what?
thought
It was against the law to speak out against a war?
yeah, well, I mean, it was wartime, basically. So the reasoning was that if we are going to go to war, then everybody needs to be on board, and any talk against the war is going to be effectively treason,
Wow.
because the war was seen as in the national interest. Basically wartime power type stuff. Yeah, it was, as you can imagine, it was very controversial. Especially since nothing like it had really been done before, probably since the Civil War. And even then, the government probably had not been able to impose nearly as much censorship, just because the government during the Civil War was much smaller, much less administrative capacity.
Yeah. So just to clarify, that means that before World War One, there was only state income tax?
As far as I know, yeah. Well, I would say, let me clarify, there was no federal income tax. I don't know what the states were doing. Maybe there were, maybe there weren't. But it was allowed for sure. But there was no federal income tax before that. There had been at various points of American history, a temporary federal income tax. But that was for emergencies like the Civil War, and it was eventually removed after that. But in the case of World War I, it became permanent, and conservatives blame Wilson for that.
Damn. I didn't know that.
Yeah, the Sedition Act was especially controversial when you consider the fact that America was hugely diverse at that time. There had been a huge immigration wave that had started in the late 1800s, and so there were huge numbers of Irish people, Germans, Italians, Jews of various kinds from Eastern Europe that had all kind of flooded into the country. And the concern on the part of the government was that there were so many people from the Central Powers, Austria and Germany and the United States, that if the United States did go to war on the side of the Entente, then a huge swaths of the country would be dead set opposed to it, and there could be, massive unrest or even civil war. Because if you're a German who's just migrated to the United States like 20 years before, the fact that you're an American citizen doesn't inherently mean that you're not still sympathetic to Germany, right? So you can't, as an American president, with such a huge number of people from, countries like Germany and Austria and whatnot in your country, just kind of leap at the chance to go to war immediately. Like you do have to think about it very carefully. So, they were American leadership before, in the lead up to World War I and in the early years of World War I, was very, very cautious, specifically on that count. And when the Wilson administration did finally decide to go to war, they knew that it would be very controversial, specifically because of all those immigrant groups being so numerous in the country. And that was part of the justification for the Sedition Act. It wasn't just that it was wartime and they thought that, everybody needed to rally behind the government and support it and whatnot. There was also real concern that there would be a major fifth column in the country, and that they needed to just nip it in the bud early by establishing that you could not criticize the war effort during wartime. Yeah, that's one of the reasons I would argue that there's a lot of conservatism in the west of the country. Because like I said before, there had been, the west of the United States had been a major hotbed of populism. But one of the things that happened as a result of World War I and the Sedition Act is that a lot of people really felt the heavy hand of government. A lot of these sort of Western Germanic communities, people who were either German or who were like second or third generation German immigrants, they felt a lot of pressure from the government. Even up to the point that a lot of people felt they needed to stop speaking German. There used to be a lot of German-speaking communities in the American West, but they started to disappear during and after World War I, because a lot of the German citizens there felt like their patriotism was in question because they weren't speaking English. And so while they did, for the most part, do that voluntarily, it was not lost on anybody that it was not being done without some government coercion. So the idea of government coercion and the heavy hand of government is not an academic question for people in the West who have ancestors who directly experienced that during the war. So you can't entirely blame them for being very suspicious of government authority correspondingly. Mm-hmm. Government authority literally changed the linguistics of broad swaths of the West on account of that Sedition Act and World War I. So that's why conservatives hate Woodrow Wilson. People on the left hate him because he was racist. And when I say racist, I don't mean like abstract systemic racism. I mean, he was very, very
Full on.
explicitly racist. Yeah. He, like, one of his favorite, activities, I guess, at bedtime was to tell his wife jokes about black people, jokes at the expense of black people, shall we say.
Yikes.
And he was very much of the mind that, the white race was the superior race, and that, while he did think that the problem of having a large minority like the African American community in the United States should be handled with care and progressivism, he also didn't think highly of them. He didn't think they were capable of much. So he was like hardcore 19th century Southern racist in that sense.
Damn.
But he was also a university professor. He's actually the only president in American history to have a PhD. So he was a very progressive figure. He was very intelligent, but he was also very much a product of his time and of his region in particular. And lots of people on the left, especially these days, are very down on him for that reason.
Chat saying that he also created the Fed.
The Federal Reserve? I don't think that's true. I think the Federal Reserve was created in 1911, which would have been before Wilson was president. So unless he was in Congress and played some kind of role in it, I don't think he would have been involved in that. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe this would be a good time for the usual disclaimer. I am not, in fact, an expert on everything I talk about on here, more painfully obvious at sometimes than others. So if I ever say anything wrong, stupid, or biased, please do tell me. If I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody. I don't read chat while we do this, but I will see it eventually. So participation is encouraged in that regard. I'm looking at the Wikipedia. So it was created in 1913 as a result of the Federal Reserve Act, which was passed by Woodrow Wilson, December 23rd, 1913. Okay, I guess it was him. But I would point out that it would have been an act of Congress that actually created it. He could have vetoed it, but I don't think the president would have been deeply involved in the process. The creation of the Federal Reserve was not quite a consensus issue. It was very controversial, but there was broad support for it because it was created in the wake of a series of financial crises. And so, people were pretty down on the financial system and wanted some kind of safety net there to manage it. So while the exact way in which to regulate the financial sector was the subject of considerable debate, which is why we have such a weird monetary system in the United States, there was pretty decent support for doing something. Yeah, most normal countries just have a central bank, and it does normal central bank things, regulating the monetary policy. It's responsible for the monetary policy of the country and also, to varying degrees, regulating various aspects of the financial sector. So most countries have a central bank that does that. In the United States, the idea of having a central bank was too controversial, which if you've ever studied the history of 19th century American politics, that's not a surprise. The politics around central banks, creating central banks, getting rid of central banks was a running theme through much of 19th century American politics. So it wasn't really any different in the early 20th century. It was still hugely controversial. And so the compromise was the Federal Reserve. They could not get consensus to create a central bank. So instead they created a system involving the leading banks of the country. Pretty much all banks, but especially the larger ones, would have votes on a committee that would be chaired by an appointee of the federal government. And the final say on decisions regarding things like interest rates would more or less be held by the government, but there would be a vote on various other governance aspects involving the Federal Reserve, and those votes would be wielded by both the government representative and by representatives of the leading banks in the country. So that was the compromise agreement. It was seen as the balancing of the public and the private. You can think of the Federal Reserve as a public-private venture, albeit a non-profit venture, unlike certain others I could name. And while that has created some issues, for the most part, it's been a workable alternative to a central bank. And everybody pretty much just treats it as the de facto central bank of the United States.
A lot of people are very against it.
I've noticed. But I mean, it's not going to be any different with any other system, right? Somebody's going to control the money supply one way or the other, and pretty much guaranteed you're not going to like those people, regardless of what they do. Some people want looser policy, some people want tighter policy. No matter, you're damned if you do, damned if you don't. And whoever controls it is going to be immensely powerful. So, whether it's private sector banks or a government-owned institution like a central bank or some weird Frankenstein's freak show like the Federal Reserve, they're going to upset broad swaths of the population regardless. So there's just no getting around that.
That makes sense. No one likes the money holders. They say, give us the money back. You don't need that much of it. Yeah, we didn't really talk about anything current yet, chat, so you didn't miss any events or drama. We talked about a lot of U.S. history to kick things off, which is cool. Appreciate you, Agent Smith.
Oh, thank you. Gives me a reason to remember all the stuff I read 10 years ago.
Yeah.
Paying attention can pay off.
Yeah, it's true.
Well, I assume that you saw the drama earlier this week.
Which drama?
So everybody was talking about how the Iranians were going to retaliate against Israel. And
oh, yeah.
everybody was waiting for it, and then it happened. Nobody asked you about it?
No.
Yeah. Well, I don't have a lot to add. I didn't expect the retaliation to amount to much, and I didn't really think the Israelis would care that much. If anything, I was wrong about them not caring, because the Israeli government did come out and say that they wanted to retaliate, but that America was holding them back, basically. So I don't know what the Israeli government expected to accomplish with some major retaliation. So it's really in their interest that the retaliation to the Iranian retaliation ended up being pretty mild. But apparently they did think that they should have retaliated more in order to try to establish a deterrence. The obsession of most every Israeli government since Israel's independence. But I don't think going hard on Iran in the wake of the Iranian strikes would have deterred them. If anything, it would have just encouraged them to go even harder. Even if they hadn't retaliated to that retaliation, like invariably, they would not have felt deterred for future such cases. But yeah, Iran did launch some strikes against Israel, and it was all the rage for a while. Everybody was squealing about World War III, as his Reddits want. Nobody can trip on so much as a dead cat in international affairs without Reddit screaming that World War III is about to break out.
Yeah, but wouldn't it be so hype if it did? Like, I think some people are just ready to sound the alarm. They're ready for the hype.
Well, even a broken clock is right twice a day.
We had a person in our chat, I think it was whenever we took out a general. It may have been the Iranian general or something, or an Iraqi general. I can't remember which general it was, but we straight up airstruck him, took him out that way, and someone firmly believed that we had just started World War III by doing so. But no one else in the chat really agreed with them, so we weren't really like on board of like, oh shit, yeah, you're right. It was like, it's gonna be okay.
Yeah, that's been pretty much my mantra with a lot of the Iran-Israel drama, if not also the Israel-Gaza drama. And pretty much been justified in most of that. I mean, the most recent strikes were a case in point. Like, it was not the start of a new war or anything. It was just more violent signaling of the sort that is despairingly common in the Middle East. So more business as usual than anything. Yeah, I found the Iranian strikes pretty interesting because they did go harder than expected. They could have just lobbed some missiles from like Yemen or Syria or something, but notably they actually did launch some of their missiles from Iran itself, which is the first time they've ever done that. And Israel did respond to it by directly striking a target in Iran proper. So even if this isn't likely to escalate further, it is at least notable in that certain lines have been crossed. Certain new precedents have been established. Like, this can happen. So that is notable at least. But as far as broader ramifications for the region and trajectory of conflict in the region, it's no real change.
Gotcha.
But as far as Iran going harder than expected, let me see if I can find the right number here. So yeah, the attack included 170 drones, 30 cruise missiles, and about 110 ballistic missiles. So it was a pretty good-sized volley. This is the kind of volley that you might launch if you were half-assing an attempt at swarming somebody's air defenses. I say half-assing because they could have launched a lot more. They have significantly more weapons than that. So, you could kind of tell by the scale that even if it was bigger than expected, it still wasn't nearly big enough to really seriously threaten Israel.
Yeah, more of a warning shot than actually trying to deal heavy damage.
Yeah. But in terms of quantity, it was quite large. So it will probably not surprise anybody to know that all of the drones were shot down. Those are pretty slow-moving targets. The Ukrainians have shown that you can down them pretty readily if you have the right equipment. And so the Israelis, of course, have the right equipment. They have like a three-pronged air defense system. And also American, French, and British and Jordanian aircraft were all on station in Jordan, ready to help shoot them down. I haven't heard anything about aircraft in Iraq. I did hear that there were some American aircraft in the air when this happened, but I haven't heard about them actually shooting anything down there. But at the very least, Western aircraft in Jordan definitely did shoot them down. So I don't know if any drones even made it to Israel proper. It seems like most of them were shot down over Jordanian airspace. So the cruise missiles were a little harder, but it seems all of them were shot down as well, if I'm remembering correctly. Let me see here. Yeah, I think that was the case. So the only munitions to make it through were the ballistic missiles, which is not surprising because those are the hardest to shoot down. Those are the ones that you fire up in an arc and then fall down on the target. And because they're falling from a very high altitude, they fall very quickly, and the target is relatively small, so fairly difficult to intercept an object that small falling at that speed. But it is possible. The United States has been working on technology to do that for decades now, and they haven't quite nailed it. It's not like 100% accuracy, but they can shoot down most of those, and that is what happened. There was a American destroyer off the coast of Israel that helped shoot down some of the ballistic missiles, an Aegis-equipped destroyer. Aegis is a system developed by the United States. Basically, it's a radar system maybe radar system doesn't even do it justice. It's a combination of systems more than anything. Radar, specifically search radar and fire control radar, and a system that sort of unifies them and allows for very rapid target acquisition. It used to be that the process of finding and then painting a target was not fully automated, but with Aegis they did. It's fully computerized process. It sounds pretty bland today, but when the technology was developed in the 70s, that was pretty cutting edge stuff. So the system has been upgraded over time, and it's capable of detecting and shooting down incoming ballistic missiles. So there was a destroyer helping with that. The Israelis themselves developed a missile system designed to shoot down high-altitude targets like ballistic missiles. I can't remember what it was called. I think Arrow is what it was called. So they shot down a bunch as well. So out of the 120 ballistic missiles fired by Iran, I think only about maybe half a dozen actually hit Israel. And don't be too impressed, because about half of those failed at launch or malfunctioned and crashed mid-flight. So really, it was only about 60 missiles that had to be intercepted. Still a reasonable amount, but easier than 120. So of the missiles that actually did hit something in Israel, I think I think two of them actually hit something. It seems they were all targeting, or at least most of them were targeting an Israeli air base in the south of Israel. And of the half dozen or so that made it, one of them hit a hangar, and then another one damaged a hangar. Just mild damage. Hit near a hangar enough to do some mild damage. So all told, it was a pinprick, pretty much. There's no casualties to speak of. I think there was like some debris from a missile that was shot down that landed on some Bedouin girl in southern Israel and injured her. I think in the first article I read, she died, but then later on I was reading she was only injured, so I didn't get an update on that. Yeah, maybe she got better. But that was the only casualty in Israel that I read about.
So, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, all told, the accuracy of the weapons Iran deployed was very poor. And in order to get any hits on Israel at all, they had to fire, 120 ballistic missiles.
Mm-hmm.
So that's not great. I mean, if you're Iranian, I'm sure it's a little bit exciting since, Israel is kind of this seemingly impermeable badass of the region. So, even being able to get a hit at all may be seen as an achievement. But, overall, having to fire just over 100 missiles just to get some minor damage on an airbase is not exactly indicative of strength.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, not a very cost-efficient trade for them there. That makes sense. Well, I don't want to derail too much, but there was someone in the chat who was getting upset that we didn't answer their question about World War III yet. So apparently they believe that World War III may be going on this whole time, ever since World War II ended. It's just a different kind of war, and I think it's the Nazis are still at it somehow. Do you know anything about this?
I mean, I've heard a couple different interpretations of World War III. I don't know that I've heard this one. This one seems exotic. The neoconservative definition of World War III is that World War III was the Cold War, and that the war on terrorism was going to be World War IV, a kind of civilizational struggle between the civilized states of the world and Islamist barbarians. But by that definition, World War III is already over. So it is, in that sense, it would not still be going on. World War III, I've also heard sort of a Huntingtonian kind of definition where there is going to be eventually a different kind of civilizational struggle, one more defined by sort of the European liberal West versus a kind of ascendant Islamist Middle East, specifically. Kind of similar to the neoconservative notion, but from their perspective, it's going to be more about values, civilizational values, than about ideology, as was the case with the neoconservative notion. But those are sort of the main notions that I've heard of World War III. I guess you could go kind of like a New World Order route, where you argue that there are elites in the West, possibly with some connections to former Nazis who have been trying to control the world from the shadows, and that this struggle could be considered to represent a kind of global struggle that could be called World War III.
Mm-hmm.
But that seems like a stretch. Normally people think of World War III as being a conventional war that would be fought between states over territory, like World War II or World War I. Once you're getting into the civilizational definition of World War III, you're getting into pretty abstract territory, and your commenter's definition seems to be even more abstract than that. That's not even really talking about conventional war, more just about politics behind the scenes by powerful elites, which is not really war, and that's more just, to varying degrees, normal. I kind of expect powerful elites to kind of pull some strings behind the scenes to a degree. That's not unusual for any country. But I don't think that can be considered a war, per se.
Well, I have a question for the chatter if they're still here. Who are the factions in this format? Who is struggling against whom? and why? But yeah, I feel like currently the biggest players in the world seem to be not wanting to fight each other just because of the cost of major scale conflict. So the main conflicts that we currently have are basically one major power versus a minor power, or minor powers fighting. If we're thinking on the scale of like who has nukes and the ability to project force.
Mm-hmm.
So in that sense, we don't see anything resembling World War II in terms of number of casualties or number of countries involved and scale of combat. You have Russia, which you could call a major power in their ability to make a lot of military stuff and shoot a bunch of stuff, but yeah, it's not quite the same scale as World War II, which was like almost everyone is in. A few countries call themselves neutral, but not very many.
Yeah, Russia is struggling with Ukraine, so I'm not sure how well they would fare in an actual broader struggle with countries much more powerful than them.
Mm-hmm.
Iran is even weaker. You know, again, they had to fire 100 missiles at a tiny country of 8-some million people just to kind of scratch the paint on a few hangars. So, you know, that's not indicative of a great ability to project force outside their borders.
Mm-hmm.
And the regime isn't exactly stable within its own borders in the first place. You know, about the only country that can really seriously pose a threat to the United States and the established international order is China. And the Communist Party of China's interest in really violently changing the international order is very limited. You know, for them, all they have to do is grow their economy and then use economic influence to kind of get what they want. And that's actually a much safer, more risk-averse, and probably more effective approach to the problem of changing the international order than some kind of violent conflagration. You know, if you want a hot take, here's a hot take for you. If China did go to war with the United States in an effort to violently change the international order, that would actually be a huge favor to the United States.
So it's playing more of their game.
Yeah, because here's the thing. In terms of economic influence, China has a much bigger, well, is much more competitive, shall we say, with the United States than it is with the United States in terms of military balance of power. Mm-hmm. So if they stick with the economic side of the competition and avoid military confrontation, the United States is actually at more of a disadvantage. Because economically, you know, the United States is very powerful, but so is China. And as we've seen, American politics is very much strained to come up with good solutions for economic influence with China. You know, it doesn't really, we don't really know how to handle that. The polity doesn't really even understand it. You know, the government is just at pains to come up with ways to even frame the problem, let alone come up with solutions. But a military struggle would be very simple. You know, that's us versus them. That's the kind of tribal conflict that Americans very much understand. So that would get a lot more public support. And America's military advantage vis-a-vis China is much larger than its economic advantage over China. So a military struggle, while it would be very difficult, would still advantage the United States, much more so than an economic struggle would.
That makes sense.
So in all likelihood, the Communist Party of China is not going to challenge the United States militarily just because they have so much more of an advantage economically. It makes much more sense for them to follow that route, because that route is much more likely to deliver success than the military route. Which is not to say that the military route is entirely out of the question or that they can't win a military confrontation, just that between choices, the economic route is the less risky one and is more likely to deliver actual results. So if you're China, then just keep winning. Like, just sit on your growing economy, continue to exert influence, and change other governments' policies via that route. It's just so much easier and simpler, and you don't have to risk anything. Like, even with Taiwan, like, the economic influence mainland China exerts over Taiwan is pretty immense at this point, and it will only grow as China's, you know, as mainland China's economy grows. So why not just leverage that over the long term? You know, why pick some fight with the United States that you may or may not win when you can pretty much guarantee an economic victory, you know, over the long term? So China's not interested in World War III. That doesn't benefit them. Even if they did, I mean, another thing to consider is that they have nowhere to expand, really. I mean, what country on the border of China has anything that they really just need but don't have already? There's not much there, really. Expansionism doesn't really behoove or benefit the Communist Party of China that much. You can make an exception for, say, the South China Sea, but that's about it. As far as like invading and conquering neighboring countries, that's not really on the table. The party's not interested in that.
Not really their modus operandi.
Yeah. So, Russia and Iran, certainly they have some expansionist tendencies, but they can't really challenge the West, or the United States. They just don't have enough power to do that. The principal advantage Russia and Iran, and to a degree China, have over the United States is that broad swaths of its population, that is to say the population of the United States, are not really that interested in waging a struggle in the first place. So, in a sense, all you have to do is threaten the United States and you could win just by default. Because it could be that Washington and the American public are not interested in some kind of grand struggle to defend the international order. Like, very clearly, there are a lot of people who think the United States is overextended and don't trust the U.S. government to responsibly wield the authority that is correspondent with maintaining a major international order. So in that sense, the main problem is just will. If the American public were unified and had the will to continue to support the international order, you would probably not see as many fireworks right now. Because make no mistake, Russian and Iranian foreign policy are very opportunistic. They're only going to push if they don't think that they're going to get significantly more pushed back. And Washington has given them lots of reasons to think that's the case over the past 10 years. But they can't realistically win a straight up fight. Like, if it comes to that, they're in trouble. Like, their entire strategy for challenging America right now is basically gambling that America doesn't care enough to actually play the game. Because if it does play the game, then that's a problem for them. I mean, keep in mind that the United States has helped float Ukraine through the first couple years of the war, despite not having had a plan at the start of the war, and pretty much half-assing support through the first couple years up until now. That's just how impactful the United States can be without even seriously committing to a conflict. You can imagine how much different things would be if we actually did fully commit to helping Ukraine, or even intervening. That would have a dramatic impact on the outcome of the conflict. So I don't think World War III is really a significant threat for those reasons. Like, even for Russia, Iran, and China, there's not that much benefit from it. And in so much as they pretend that they're willing to fight World War III, it's only because they think by threatening World War III that the West will back down and not actually fight a conflict.
Yeah, it's just such a big gamble to try to go for the military win condition with nuke technology.
Yeah, it's not the wisest course of action. But when you have ideologues in control of countries that have big ambitions, they tend to take gambles.
Mm-hmm.
And nuclear weapons are not really enough to deter them from making those gambles. So here we are.
Yep. Here we are in the silly timeline, trying our best.
Yeah, I've seen lots of anti-globalist type people make arguments that, there's a globalist cabal running the world and undermining the sovereignty of individual nation states. And that the evidence for that is just the general trend of globalization over the past 30 years, where economies have become increasingly globally integrated and where political decisions have increasingly been devolved away from elected officials towards more bureaucratic type positions. The European Union is generally the focus for a lot of that kind of criticism. There's a sense that decisions regarding economic policy are no longer in the hands of elected representatives in national governments and are increasingly in the hands of unelected bureaucrats in the European Union Commission. That's half true. I mean, it's not an unfair criticism. Certainly the European Union has a democratic deficit, and that a lot of its higher offices, well, pretty much all of its higher offices are not elected, not counting the European Parliament, which is mostly toothless anyway, so, it doesn't really count. But at the same time, all of those positions, while they're not elected, are appointed by governments that are themselves elected. And more to the point, if the European Commission ever does something that a government doesn't want to do, it's very easy for that government's representative in the European Union Commission to sabotage that effort. And even if the effort goes through, very frequently governments will just ignore shit that it doesn't like. Case in point being the immigration issue in Europe. The European Union wants all members to express solidarity in the face of the challenge of all of these millions of immigrants and refugees coming into Europe by agreeing to host a certain proportion of them so that the burden is not disproportionately on countries like Germany or Greece, where many of them end up. They want to distribute them throughout the European Union so that the burden can be distributed more evenly. And a lot of governments in Eastern Europe really fucking hate that. And they've basically all but said, we're never going to do that. And they've kept to their word. They have refused to host them despite pleading by the European Union that has gone on for more than 10 years now. So, this idea that the European Union is some kind of evil empire that is foisting unwanted policies upon unsuspecting people is not really accurate. There's some truth to it in so much as there's a democratic deficit, but the reality is that most governments in the European Union just do whatever the fuck they want anyway. In so much as they go along with policies that they don't want to go along with, it's more because they get badgered and pressured into doing so by more powerful countries in the European Union. And I would point out that if you got rid of the European Union, that would still happen. It's not as though France and Germany are going to stop pushing around other countries in Europe to do stuff they don't want to do just because there's not a European Union. In fact, if you look at the history of Europe before the European Union, you'll note that there was quite a bit of that going on, dramatically so in the early 20th century. So, a lot of this hand-wringing about the European Union seems, while somewhat justified, also a little bit disingenuous to me. Certainly there's room for reform and improvement. I would be the first to argue that. But the complaints about the European Union, that it's undemocratic and that it's authoritarian, that seems a lot more partisan to me than substantive. Because there are things that the European Union kind of de facto rules out as a matter of consensus. For people on the far left, the European Union is too neoliberal, too pro-market. And then for people on the far right, the European Union is too pro-immigration and too anti-national in its nature. And yes, to a degree that's baked in to an institution like the European Union. But the reason the European Union is like that is because that was the consensus when it was created. It's not as though there's not it's not as though there's at least a slim majority of people in Europe that want Europe to look like that, that want the values that are epitomized by the European Union to define Europe as a whole. And while there are, degrees of variation between countries and between political ideologies on that, most people are still behind it. And I think that's more behind the frustration of the anti-European Union folks. For them, the issue is not so much the European Union itself, so much as the fact that their opponents in, whatever countries, pretty much all of Europe, their political opponents in Europe are institutionalizing their preferences to a degree that is making it harder for them to achieve their preferences. And that to them seems very unfair. And, you can't blame them. There is truth to that. But you can't say it's entirely undemocratic or that it doesn't have a democratic mandate. Like, there is broad-based support in Europe for the European Union. It's not as big a majority as it used to be. In some countries and on some issues, it's not even a majority. But by and large, it's still pretty popular. Like, it's not going away. It maybe will not federalize. It may not centralize much more than it already has, but that just speaks to the legitimacy and flexibility of the European Union. And the fact that, again, international politics, that is to say, the importance of the nation state and competition and negotiation between nation states, has not gone away. The European Union has not destroyed the nation state. In fact, the nation state is at the heart of the European Union system and how it functions. And in that sense, the most important and substantive criticism about the European Union, that it does mitigate the importance of the nation state, is also the most hollow criticism. Because again, nation states and their interests are still very much driving events there.
Yeah, there's no, you just made me think of the federal tax that the US has. Where does the EU get its money?
Value-added tax. There's a European-wide value-added tax. And it's kind of collected by individual nation states, and it's added on top of any value-added tax that individual nation states may already have, which is totally allowed. But they have to add on a bit for the European value-added tax, and they transfer that money over to the European Union. I think there's also some stuff like tariffs and fees and stuff like that, but I think the VAT is the main one. I would point out that the European Union budget is not very large, which again reflects the fact that individual nation states in Europe are still the main actors in Europe.
Mm-hmm. Does it have an army?
It does not.
Okay.
It's kind of supposed to. I think it was in one of the original treaties that was something they were supposed to build towards. Like one of the long-term objectives is a more centralized European Union that has an ability to defend itself, but there's been virtually no progress on that count. Technically, the European Union comes with an obligation for members to defend other members that come under attack, but I don't think anybody's ever taken it seriously. When it comes to security in Europe, NATO is still like the main institution. So even though the European Union technically has provisions that would obligate defense, I don't think anybody really cares that much. Nobody pays attention to it. And there's very limited cooperation on defense matters between European Union states. Most defense cooperation, in so much as it happens in Europe anyway, is NATO, organized by NATO or happens under the rubric of NATO. European Union defense cooperation, by contrast, is extremely mild and extremely limited. France pushes that very hard. They want the European Union to have a stronger defense component, but they just have a hell of a time convincing anybody that it's a worthwhile endeavor, and so there's very little cooperation there.
Yeah, it makes sense they would have different opinions on it, though.
Oh, yeah. Everybody wants to maintain their own defense industrial base because it's a source of jobs and patronage. It's politically useful, but it would be more efficient if there was like a single European defense industrial base. But the compromise and negotiations that would be required to decide what goes where, who gets what, and more difficult, who loses what, since invariably some countries would lose certain industries, that's just been too thorny an issue to settle. Like, nobody's been able to get that far. So everybody is kind of siloed into their own little defense industrial base space and handles things on their own. Occasionally, there will be cooperation on individual projects between countries. But I think like Italy and Britain and Japan have some kind of thing going on like a new aircraft they're trying to develop. But beyond projects like that, there's really not much. And there's a lot of redundance. There's a lot of redundant activity happening, needlessly so, which is very inefficient and makes things a lot more expensive than it needs to be. But again, the politics make it impossible to change. Nobody wants to be the country to give up, their tank industry or their plane industry or, whatever kind of defense industry they would end up having to lose in order to create a more consolidated, centralized, European-wide industry.
Interesting. Yeah, Europe as a whole, if you counted it as a country in terms of GDP, would be huge.
Yeah, bigger than the US.
Yeah. They have a lot of different languages and a lot of different cultures and stuff mixed in, though. So it's hard to have the same level of unity.
Yeah, it's kind of a postmodern Holy Roman Empire in a way. In so much as that it nominally has a supranational structure, but that the real power lays with the subnational entities. Holy Roman Empire was very similar in that regard.
Oh, that's interesting. Well, I don't know if we have questions for today, but you said the main news item for this week was the Iranian strikes at Israel.
Yeah, that's the big one. And the Israeli government, after the strikes happened, said, we're going to get you, we're going to retaliate. And the U.S. told them very politely but firmly, like, we would really rather you not do that.
Mm-hmm.
I think Joe Biden even said, just take the W. I think he wrote that on Twitter.
That's funny.
But the Israeli government, if you look at doctrine in Israel, like there is a preoccupation with deterrence. Mm-hmm. And, the fact that Iran launched weapons from its own territory and hit Israel for the Israeli government signified that they needed to establish that when Iran does that, there will be a response from Israel. So even though the U.S. government didn't want them to, Israel did end up retaliating. But the airstrikes they launched were pretty mild, much more so than some of the hawks in Israel probably would have liked. They actually hit an Iranian airbase in Isfahan, which is notable because Isfahan is an important site in Iran's nuclear program. And near as I can tell from what I've read, they did not actually hit any targets related to Iran's nuclear program. But the fact that they chose an airbase in Isfahan is probably signaling on their part that, well, we're not hitting nuclear stuff right now. We could very easily reach Isfahan. So if we wanted to hit nuclear stuff, it would be an academic matter. We could very easily do so. But as was, they just did some minor damage to an airfield, which I would point out is fairly proportional. Even though Iran launched like a huge series of drones and cruise missiles and ballistic missiles, the only actual damage they did was minor damage to an airfield in southern Israel. So Israel doing some minor damage to an airbase in Isfahan is pretty proportional, and so in that sense, probably pretty fair. Yeah, that also is a signal from Israel that it's going to be tit for tat.
But not World War III.
Not World War III. Yeah, the Iranian government actually was pretty funny. After the Iranian government launched all of its missiles and drones at Israel, they published a tweet on Twitter that said, "We consider the matter concluded." So that for them was enough. Because keep in mind, the Iranian strikes themselves were retaliation for an Israeli airstrike on an Iranian consulate in Syria, which is, again, consulates are technically the territory of the country they belong to. So by striking an actual diplomatic facility, that did technically violate the sovereignty of Iran. So the Iranian government felt that deserved a stronger response than just a regular airstrike in Syria targeting, the IRGC or some weapons depots or whatever, which has been going on pretty consistently for like 10 years. Mm-hmm. Nothing unusual in that. But again, the unusual thing here is that they had a consulate, so the Iranians wanted to escalate and retaliate for that. So that led to the barrage of missiles and drones, and so that led to the Israeli retaliation to that retaliation. And there was a question of whether there might be an escalating tit for tat after that, but the Iranians have basically said that they're done. Some commentators on Iranian media were even disputing whether or not the airstrike even happened. That is to say, the airstrike on Iran retaliating for the barrage. So it seems that the Iranian government is kind of signaling that they consider the matter like done with. Like the Israeli retaliation was sufficiently mild for them to ignore it and move on. Mm-hmm. So everybody has made their point. Everybody has finished the dick measuring contest, and status quo ante has ensued correspondingly.
Okay, now we're going to go back to normal. Okay, fine.
Yeah,
back to status quo with you.
So the Iranians have gone back to arming and funding their various militias in the region, and the Israelis have gone back to fighting their war/counterterrorism operation in Gaza, which continues unabated. Mm. No real updates or changes there.
They didn't get the hostages back either?
No. Okay. I think a few more were found dead. So I guess that's a development, but No, none have been found or otherwise recovered alive lately.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. I did have some other Israel stuff. Netanyahu is still insisting that the Israeli military will attack Rafah. He's been whining about that for months now, so, whatever. We'll see. Talk is cheap. We'll see what he actually does. There's been more violence in the West Bank. It hasn't really escalated a whole lot, but there's been a consistent low level of violence in the West Bank since the war in Gaza started. So the most recent one was a 14-year-old Israeli shepherd was killed in the West Bank. He was herding some sheep and disappeared, and then later on they found his dead body. So presumably he was killed by Palestinians of one kind or another. And so some of the local Israeli settlers retaliated by rioting in a nearby Palestinian village. The IDF had to go in and break that up, but a number of houses and cars and whatnot were set on fire and otherwise damaged. The government says that it'll find the perpetrators of the whoever murdered the shepherd boy, but it's also trying to discourage settlers from retaliating, saying that it will quote unquote impede investigation, end quote. Mm. So that's the kind of violence that we've been seeing since October of last year in the West Bank. It's a pretty steady drumbeat. Mm-hmm. And most recently, the U.S. government has said that it's going to target an IDF unit that is comprised of ultra-Orthodox Jews for sanctions and a cutoff of aid. Apparently, this particular unit has been linked to violence in the West Bank, and they want to kind of punish it basically as a signal to Israel about displeasure over the general trajectory of the conflict in Gaza, among other things. The West Bank, the settlements. There's lots of thorny issues in the Israeli-American relationship, but the U.S. has continued to escalate its pressure vis-a-vis the conflict in Gaza in particular, and so this is the latest manifestation of that. The Israeli government actually had the gall to complain about the United States government meddling in Israeli politics, which is pretty rich, given how often they meddle in American politics. No penalty for hypocrisy in politics, Neuro.
Nope. Give your enemies as much bad press as possible and create as much good press for yourself as possible. Anything goes. Attention span and memory of the public is not very high.
That's putting it mildly.
They'll forget in 4 seconds.
Oh, yeah.
The chat has currently been arguing about the abacus. I'm not sure why.
The abacus.
The abacus, yes.
What, like the thing you use to calculate stuff?
Yeah.
Is that a thing you can even argue about?
It is now.
I guess leave it to the internet to find a way, huh?
Yeah. We need to figure this out. People have their opinions and they hold them strongly. I went to the beach yesterday with my girlfriend, and we went to an Earth Day rally hosted by animal rights activists who were looking for, say, for example, companies that sell eggs for them to allow their chickens to be cage-free. A lot of companies will make the claim of, hey, we're gonna go cage-free and let the chickens wander around, basically satisfy whatever that criteria is of how many square feet of mobility each bird gets. But they've made these claims and not followed through, so it's kind of raising awareness for issues like that. Also just kind of articulating the plus sides of being environmentally conscious and eating vegan and stuff like that. And that was a relatively peaceful protest, is kind of the vibe of their mainly sharing information and talking about each other's journeys and stuff and encouraging people to eat good vegan food and so on. And it was interesting seeing the parade, or I guess the march, walking through the beach and walking along the pier, and also seeing other people who were arguing for different things. There were a lot of people who were basically pushing Christian evangelism in some sense of we need to be respecting God and pray to God, and some pretty mainstream Christian stuff. And then you have some people who are spreading the same message, but they're doing it with music, where they're performing and they're singing and stuff. Maybe they have there was one guy who had like a guitarist who was playing with him. And then there was also, I think, some people who were dancing and kind of singing some music that was related to Hare Krishna. Which
Are they still around?
I don't know what that is. Do you know what that is?
Yeah, that's like a very particular Hindu sect that worships Krishna and is a Hindu deity. Yeah, they have their roots in India, but they got popular back in like the 60s, I think, in the United States. And they started proselytizing pretty heavily. Yeah, they were one of the groups, along with other religious proselytizers that managed to aggravate people at airports enough that eventually there was a rule passed that you can't proselytize in airports anymore, which is why you don't see it these days.
Huh.
Yeah, back in the 70s, very common still. Yeah, have you ever seen the movie Airplane? It's a comedy.
Yeah, I know. I should have seen this. I don't think I saw it though.
Definitely go out of your way to see it sometime. It's worth it. It's goofy.
It's very funny, yeah.
It's not like fancy highfalutin comedy, but yeah, it'll definitely be memorable. But there's a scene where the main character, or one of the main characters, is walking through the airport and he's getting harassed by all these religious proselytizers trying to push their religion on him. And that was actually normal for the 70s. Like that was not at all uncommon.
In airports specifically?
Airports specifically, yeah. Other places as well, but in airports it was it was a notable part of the airport experience, shall we say, until it was banned, and then they had to stop. But Hare Krishnas in particular were like one of the ones that stood out because they were neither Christian nor any of the other major monotheistic religions. They were pretty much the only Eastern religion that were major proselytizers in that period, if I remember correctly. I don't think Buddhists were doing it so much, but the Hare Krishna guys were.
Interesting. Well, they were just kind of dancing around. They weren't really saying words at people, but they seemed fairly cheerful. There weren't really any people who were mean. I think the meanest ones were like the people who are going to bat hard for like, you're going to go to hell if you don't get saved by Jesus kind of a thing. Sometimes Christians will get a little bit aggressive about it.
Well, you know how it is. Some people prefer that Old Testament.
Yeah. Old Testament kind of more of a judgment gospel rather than a gospel of love. People have their favorite parts of the Bible. I can respect it. But yeah, it was interesting too seeing some people who want to take the opportunity to oppose whatever is being chanted. So the vegan march people would say something like, eat plants and plant trees, which, cool. That's a valid thing that you can encourage others to do. And then some tourists and people will kind of walk by and they'll say, eat steak, kind of a thing, which is valid for them to say that they enjoy steak. Like, that's fine. That's also a time for them to be contrarian. And I was talking with Trisha about how eating meat has been marketed and kind of talked about as a very macho thing to do. So for guys, it feels like you're kind of scoring some macho cred by talking about all the ridiculous amount of meat that you've been eating and stuff. Because it kind of fits with that hunter mindset of we hunted and got some stuff for the village and now we can boast about it kind of a deal. So I feel like meat in that sense has at least been marketed to people as a masculine kind of food stuff because it involves violence, and a lot of people kind of connect masculinity with a more violent attitude rather than a more peaceful one. But yeah, interesting seeing all that play out. Nothing was really that awkward or weird for me. I had a good time. It was very nice out. I would say the main bad thing that happened was I got slightly sunburned because I'm normally a a cave-dwelling gamer, you know. Go outside and I get cooked.
Yeah, yeah. You know, you spend enough time inside, you kind of forget the standard operating procedure for outside activities.
No, I had sunscreen on, but I didn't
Really?
keep track of time. Yeah.
Oh, that's what it was. Okay.
Yeah. I think we were out for like 6 hours, so I should have reapplied maybe halfway through.
Gotcha. Yeah, I spent a long time mostly inside through much of grad school and whatnot, during which time I started balding. And so when I finally did do a major outdoor thing a couple years ago, I was unprepared, to put it mildly. And the result is that I got sunburned on top of my bald head, which is an awkward place to get it.
Yeah.
Let me tell you. So lesson learned. After that, I have made a habit of wearing hats, specifically because of that.
Well, I'm glad that you've learned and figured out the adjustment to that. Chat's saying that men act like eating meat means you went and fucking hunted a mammoth. Which normally people just purchase a good at the store, which is a very similar experience to purchasing a vegetable. There isn't really much of a difference, rather than it's mainly just which section of the grocery store you go to. The thing that I feel like was the biggest light bulb moment for me that I didn't understand for animal rights was the ratio of factory farming to local farming. Most of the times when you're driving along a road, the cows and stuff that you see on the side of the road, that's like the better end of how cows are treated, but that's a pretty small percentage of the overall output of meat products in the US. Because the ones that are really cranking out high volume are jamming their animals into big metal facilities and giving them very little space, and nobody sees those because those are like big factory buildings far away from eyes. Whereas the farms next to roads, it looks pretty happy. And that's a reason why I didn't really investigate vegetarianism or veganism much for myself, was the visibility of animal abuse isn't really there unless you go looking for it, because the companies that are the main perpetrators are pretty good at keeping other people out. So the people there were doing a pretty good job of like articulating those kind of things, and obviously there are lots of videos you can see of it, but that's something that has quietly changed over the course of the past centuries, is just getting more and more economically efficient with farming techniques. And in some ways that's a plus, but in some ways, if you're optimizing for the cheapest possible meat product, you're going to be cutting into the like treatment of the animal, because you're not going to monetize for that unless the consumer demands it, which that's something that people can be more mindful of, even if you don't want to pursue veganism or vegetarianism. Just kind of understanding where your stuff is sourced from and what's involved in that, because most people don't really know too much about it, as I did not.
Yeah, the supply chains behind consumer goods can be very long and complicated. So, you know, lots and lots of people just have no idea the history and stories behind the plastic goods at the store.
Yeah, and another one too is thinking about the different ways that food products are advertised to us in general, and not even just food, but like cigarettes and alcohol as well. And how there's a lot more advertising about food than there is education about food for what people are exposed to. If you added up a person's commercial watching time for fast food and soft drinks, that's probably a lot more time than they got in a health and diet class. It's very much more so about what drives money in terms of diet than what drives health. Because what drives health is kind of a lofty concept. And let's be honest, people don't want to eat salads all the time. You want some warm food, you want some comfort food, you want some mashed potatoes and stuff like that. So yeah, it's an interesting landscape, but it's very funny seeing these like older 70s and 80s commercials that are like a bunch of dudes being macho and flexing their muscles and stuff, and it's being like, real men eat this super sausage breakfast. And it's like, yeah, and they're like guys jumping up and down and stuff, and they're doing sports, and it's like, man, if I want to be a manly man, I must need this big sausage breakfast. to get the calories that I need. You don't
Yeah.
actually, but they definitely appealed to some aspect of who you are as a person, and also I think just kind of pointing to areas where people are insecure and you can give them some kind of security. Like, you'll have credibility for this criteria if you purchase our good. This could also be a clothing thing of like, real men wear this clothing item, or wear these shirts, or buy these colognes. It's very funny that we get marketed things in this way.
Well, you know, people have their identities.
Yeah.
They can define them in strange, sometimes bizarre ways. So certainly meat is one of those.
Yep.
You know, I can't deny that I certainly have a fondness for hot dogs and, you know, things like that that are very meat oriented. But I wouldn't build a personal identity out of that either.
It's not really how you brand yourself whenever people ask you, like, what are you about? And it's like, well, hot dogs.
Yeah, if my diet over the past 10 years had no hot dogs or buffalo wings, I would be considerably lighter now. So I'm certainly a fan.
I used to get the Blazing Buffalo Wild Wings. Boy, howdy. Those make your poops a nightmare.
Yeah, I can see how there would be much pain involved.
Yeah. Also, chicken really isn't the most friendly either in terms of on your dietary tract. So, yeah, that was one of those like luxury purchases where I would get that for myself, get the Blazing Wild Wings, and then know that it was going to be bad the next day and just be like, yep, that's something that I've signed up for here. But yeah, it's very interesting shifting away from the old school of farm to table, of when you used to basically be in a village and the food that you got was either food that you grew or harvested yourself or was from somewhere nearby. Whereas now we can send food over continents basically on a regular basis. It's a pretty different game.
Yeah. You know, you bring up spicy food, Neuro, and I was actually just talking to a Chinese friend the other day about a drink in Beijing that I had when I was over there. And it's a special drink that has an interesting property, which is that it can very quickly, almost immediately, remove that sort of heat, I guess, that comes with spicy food, right? It burns your tongue, it's hot. But when you drink this, it deals with it just like that. It's like an immediate remedy. And I was really surprised because, you know, everybody's got remedies for like spicy food, right? Like what can you do to deal with the heat? And they've got this, that, or the other, but none of them really work. But this was the first one I'd ever had that actually did work. It really surprised me. Yeah. And I was thinking recently about trying to kind of, one, figure out what it was called since I'd forgotten because it was so long ago, but also to see if I could get some here in the United States and test it out on some buffalo wings. Basically an excuse to eat buffalo wings, in other words. You know, that's the real impetus. But yeah, since you mentioned that, I thought you might be interested. It was based off of sour plums. It was a kind of sour plum juice. It's not just sour plums, mind you. They had some other ingredients in there as well. But the main one was sour plum juice.
Interesting.
Yeah, I don't remember the exact name. It was like Suan Mei Tung, something like that. Yeah, I was trying to figure it out with my friend the other day. You know, we were able to find it, but it didn't seem like there was much in the United States. So I'm going to try to explore more there and see what I can find.
So are you going to like take up a life of going to spicy food competitions and mopping the floor with your secret juice?
No, nothing so dramatic.
Well, if you do, let me know. That'd be pretty funny.
I'll definitely let you know. But, you know, first, though, I just want to kind of try it again and see if it was just like a one-off thing in China or maybe it actually is just very robust. Because if that is like a real remedy, then I'm kind of surprised it hasn't taken off elsewhere. Well, I guess maybe I shouldn't be surprised. It's not very masculine to try to get rid of the heat, right? You're supposed to bear
You're
through
supposed
it.
to suffer, yes. As a man, by the traditional norms, you are allowed to experience two emotions and two emotions only. You can experience anger because it is violent and okay to be violent as a man. I'm not saying this for me, chat. This is the norm. Violence is okay for men, so you can be angry. And then lust is also okay. You're allowed to be horny. But you are not allowed to be sad. You're not allowed to be envious. You're also not allowed to complain about anything unless it's specifically related to lust or anger. Yeah, it's ends up being very kind of asymmetrical and limiting with how you can express emotions if you can only distill them into those two outcomes. And people end up getting more angry than they need to because they haven't really practiced, say, being vulnerable. Like being vulnerable and saying, hey, I'm not really doing okay, I could use a hug. That's a very not manly thing to say, and it's a very weak thing to say, and you'll get made fun of for that. So interesting pressures we apply to the gender norms and so on. That's being challenged by a lot of groups and stuff right now. So things are definitely opening up in that sense of kind of questioning what the norms have been, and then also just being okay with people expressing in different ways than their traditions might expect them to, and how that's okay as well.
Yeah, some shift in that regard. But I guess that's why the sour plum juice hasn't really gotten a big audience here.
Oh yeah. Just deal with the pain.
Yeah. I guess that kind of reveals me as the glutton that I am. I don't care if I look tough. I just want more food.
Yeah.
And if drinking the special Far Eastern secret sauce allows me to do that, that's what I'm going to do.
It makes sense to me. I don't hassle people about their macho cred. It was something that was definitely done in like football and stuff growing up in Texas. It's a very macho culture, so people are always very careful about how they're acting and stuff, and they don't want to be caught being uncool. Turns out that most people in chat were saying that coolness is defined by doing what you like even without other people's approval, but a lot of people who strive to be cool are people who are trying to do like the currently trendy or interesting thing of the time. So that's more fragile in terms of expressing yourself, because you're kind of constantly looking around and seeing what other people are supposed to be doing in this case, and then doing that. Yeah, just be yourself. Pretty straightforward.
Well, I did have a correction for you.
Sure.
Last time I said that the United States was a leader in the world in terms of FDI, foreign direct investment, and that it was a huge amount, and that we get it probably several $100 billion a year in terms of foreign investment coming into the country as FDI. So I checked the number because I wanted to check my work, and I was wrong about the number. It's not a few $100 billion a year. In 2021, it was $6.37 trillion.
Oh. Okay.
So I was off by a couple orders of magnitude.
Oops. Good of you to
I was
fix
right
it.
about the U.S. being a top destination, but wrong about the amount.
It is hard to admit when you're wrong in life, but if you can embrace that process, you can be a more correct person over time. I really like having that enthusiastic energy whenever you're proven wrong about something. So chat, feel very free if we mess up anything to be like, hey guys, you actually got that one wrong. Because if a person is stubborn about being wrong, then they continue to be wrong over time. And that's just less truthiness, less informational accuracy. And we don't want to fall by the wayside and get stuck on stuff that's untrue. So thank you, Chad. Thank you for your corrections and your critiques. I actually saw, it's funny whenever people argue in comments and then they end up bonding over the fact that they're both getting censored at the same time for what they're talking about. It's really good. It's the horseshoe. They get more and more opposite in issues, and then because they're both extreme about the issue, they end up having overlap in their experience, and then they bond. and then become friends.
There you go.
Yeah.
Something in common.
Yep. I have seen that sometimes too when it comes to like people who are really racist toward a demographic, but then there's a group within that demographic that's racist against the other. So they both really agree that they should just not be around each other. And they end up agreeing on policy. So silly.
Well, I guess that is a kind of consensus anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, did you see the Ukraine bill finally passed the House Saturday?
I did not see that.
Yeah. They've been arguing about that for months. But they did finally vote on it, and it did finally pass in the House. So now it just has to pass the Senate, which it most likely will, since they already passed a similar bill, some weeks ago. Mm-hmm. So the votes are definitely there in the Senate. So it's basically just a matter of time then until aid to Ukraine resumes.
Gotcha.
So it'll be about $61 billion of various kinds of aid that will be going over.
And then
a lot of that is, go ahead.
That's just to clarify, that's not like U.S. taxpayer dollars. That would be the value of stuff that we are giving them, some of which is secondhand or in storage.
Some of it is stuff that we're transferring over. Some of it is money that we're investing in our own defense industrial base so that we can increase our capacity, our ability to produce things like artillery shells and other stuff. Since there was a glaring problem there that was revealed by the war in Ukraine. So some of the money is going to go to that, and it's also got miscellaneous other stuff in it. Mm-hmm. So it comes in a variety. The aid comes in a variety of forms. Some of it is just dollars that are being offered to Ukraine to help it pay things like government worker salaries, for example, or to procure things like electrical equipment, since their electrical grid is coming under attack. Some of it is debt relief, what have you. A variety, again, just a grab bag of stuff. But the most important element for the war effort is going to be the artillery shells. That's been the thing the Ukrainian army and the Ukrainian government have been complaining about the most. So that'll offer some relief if and when it passes the Senate and they actually start shipping over more shells. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's true that in 2022, a lot of the aid given was in the form of equipment in inventory that was being picked up and shipped over to Ukraine and just given to them. Mm-hmm. But basically, inventories have been depleted at this point. Probably in 2023, actually, more like. So available inventories available for transfer have depleted to the point where that's no longer the main source of stuff being given to Ukraine. At this point, most of it is newer stuff. Either that or stuff that is being bought off secondary markets. There was a big plan proposed by the Czech government to buy something like 1 million artillery shells off of the private sector market from a variety of sources that the government did not really elaborate on. It wasn't entirely clear where they were going to get them, but they did say it could be done and they wanted money to do it. And I think that plan did go through, although I'm not sure there have been any actual deliveries yet. So, either the private sector, be it from other countries' inventories who aren't involved in the conflict, or from just whoever may have them, you can buy them from them, or you can make new ones. But inventories in Western countries are mostly depleted, so that's not really a viable source of new transfers at this point.
Gotcha.
So the Ukraine bill passed. I would point out, too, that the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, changed his approach to the problem, and that's the main reason it was able to happen. Because he had been the principal bloc before. He was saying that he did not want to bring it to a vote. He was opposed to it, the bill and the idea of bringing it to the vote. So it seemed like it was going to be virtually impossible to do other than by petition. Technically you can force a vote in Congress by petition, but there were so many competing petitions to do that that it seemed like that wasn't going to work either. Nobody could agree on whether the Democrats' petition or the Republicans' petition should be the one they voted for. So everything was in a deadlock, and it was looking like it wasn't going to happen. But then Mike Johnson agreed to separate all of the different elements in the different proposed bills into individual votes. Because before it had been a kind of an omnibus bill where they had bills would have Ukraine aid and Israel aid and Taiwan aid and other stuff all in the same bill. And different people had different feelings about different aspects of the bill. So Mike Johnson basically just finally threw up his hands and said, fuck it, we'll just vote on each individual thing. And that took some courage on his part, because a lot of people in the Republican Party in the House of Representatives were saying that if he did that, if he brought it to any kind of vote, be it in omnibus form or individual separate bills, they were going to try to remove him as Speaker. And, he kind of angsted about it, and finally he did cave in and agree to the different bills, the separate individual bills, and bringing them to a vote. And basically, the way it panned out on the Ukraine bill, all of the Democrats voted for it, and then I think something like, 10 or 20 Republicans voted for it, and that was enough to get it passed. And then there was kind of similar dynamics with regard to the other bills, like the Israel bill, the Taiwan bill, and then the TikTok/Russian asset bill that they did. Yeah, they're banning TikTok, Neuro.
I heard. Is that actually going to happen this time? Because it's been threatened to be banned for a long time.
They're not actually going to ban it. What they're going to do is they're going to force ByteDance, the Chinese company that owns TikTok, to divest themselves of TikTok. And they're not even going to divest themselves of all of TikTok. They're just going to sell off the American branch of TikTok.
Oh.
So TikTok will continue to exist. You will continue to be able to get your stupid short-form videos. That will still be available. It's just not going to be owned in the United States by the same company. So that's the only thing that's going to change. And it probably won't be noticeable. They'll probably run it exactly the same way they were running it before. And I would point out, too, that the Chinese company ByteDance that owned it before will probably continue to get the data that they were getting through the app before they end up divesting it. Because what will happen is that the new American company will probably sell them that data. So, obviously they would have preferred to get the data for free like they were, as they would have been before divesting, but that's not really going to be that big a barrier. So, the government is kind of stupid if it thinks that forcing the divestment is going to protect data, quote unquote. That's not going to happen. The market for data is huge. So that's not going to be a significant barrier. I mean, really, the TikTok ban is just about posturing. It's just about people, specifically politicians in Washington, trying to show how anti-China they are and to show that they're, quote unquote, protecting America. But it's not really a substantive move. It's not really accomplishing anything. But they did vote to do it, so it is going to happen. Yeah, that same bill had a provision that will allow the U.S. government to appropriate Russian assets in the United States so that they can be used for whatever reason. Generally it's aid to Ukraine. There's been a lot of talk about how Ukraine will eventually be able to pay for the reconstruction of its economy when the war ends, which will happen, presumably at some point. And it's going to be expensive. So one of the ideas floated is that the West, the United States and Europe, could seize Russian assets in their territories, sell those assets, and, either sell the assets or just give the assets to Ukraine. Sell the assets on a secondary market and take that money and give it to Ukraine, or just give the assets to Ukraine. Put it like that. And so the proceeds from doing so could be used to help Ukraine reconstruct its economy. Alternatively, Ukraine could just use the money to buy more, guns and stuff. That would also be helpful. But regardless of what Ukraine ends up using the money for, there is now going to be a seizure of Russian assets in the United States, which isn't all that much compared to total global Russian assets. I think it's only like $40 billion or so, something in that realm. But, every little bit helps. And it'll be even more helpful if it sets a precedent that encourages Europe to follow suit, because there's actually a lot more Russian assets in Europe proper. So if those are seized, that'll generate a significant amount of money, probably more in the range of 100 or 200 some billion euros.
Yeah, and Chad, if anyone who's listening, if this applies to you or anyone you know, that $40 billion is not that much, our PayPal is Neurozerg.
Yeah, not that much in the grand scheme of things. Let's add that addendum.
Okay.
Yeah, so the way it's going to break down, Ukraine is going to get, $61 billion is going to be spent as part of the Ukraine bill. The Israeli bill involved $26.4 billion, the Taiwan bill, $8 billion. And then, TikTok ban Russian bill didn't cost anything. You know, the best things in life are free, so to speak. So yeah, all told, I think it comes out to around just short of $100 billion, all told. Which is a lot of money in absolute terms, but keep in mind the total federal budget is like $6 trillion. So not that much relative to total federal spending in the United States.
That makes sense. Chad was saying that there's also aid to Israel or to Gaza and Taiwan in the bill.
Yeah, $26 billion for Israel, $8 billion for Taiwan.
Gotcha.
But again, those were separate bills. They all were voted on and passed separately. That was the only way they could make it work. Yeah, the Israel bill is mostly just ammunition so that they can restock their air defense munitions and also artillery to a lesser degree. I think Israel is leaning more on smart munitions than just artillery. Ukraine is definitely using lots of artillery, but Israel not as much. Yeah, the Taiwan bill, I actually did have a small breakdown of that. So out of the $8.1 billion going towards Taiwan, it's going to be $3.3 billion to develop submarine infrastructure. I think that might actually be for the United States Navy specifically, but that's going to be to the benefit of Taiwan. $2 billion in foreign military financing for Taiwan and other key allies. That's going to be to help them finance procurement of new weapon systems of one kind or another in the United States. And then $1.9 billion to replenish defense items and services provided to Taiwan and regional partners. So, Taiwan has a lot of older equipment. It's obsolescing, needs to be replaced. The United States is going to help them replace that stuff. So basically helping arm Taiwan,
Gotcha.
in short. Yeah, there was some controversy about it because people were saying that because the United States was giving so much equipment to Ukraine, both old equipment and newly produced equipment, that it was having the effect of crowding out Taiwan, because all of the stuff being sent to Ukraine was stuff that was not being sent to Taiwan. And the new stuff that Taiwan had ordered from the United States was having to be delayed because producers in the United States were prioritizing production for Ukrainian demand. So there was a big desire to try to help out Taiwan by increasing financial support to them so that they could navigate some of those difficulties. And so that has come to pass. Beijing will not like it, to put it mildly. But in the grand scheme of things, $8 billion is not that much, so, they don't have too much to complain about in that regard.
Not making them sweat too much, yeah.
Yeah. They still have a pretty sizable numerical advantage over the Taiwanese military. So, I think they'll be fine. Yeah, the only other Ukraine items I had was some talk in Europe about generating more funds to aid Ukraine, with which to aid Ukraine. There's a lot of concern about what will happen if Trump gets reelected in the U.S. So there's been more focus on trying to bolster support to Ukraine to try to make up for a potential shortfall in future American support. So they've actually been talking about a 5-year, 100 billion euro fund to provide quote unquote long-term military support for Ukraine. Which, it's not all that much. 5 years, so that's what, 20 billion euros a year. Again, billions of euros, that's a lot of money in absolute terms, but in terms of the cost of war, 20 billion per year is not going to get you very far. But it's better than nothing, and it does show that at least Europe recognizes the potential problem and is trying to prepare for it, which is more than you could say about their perspective and approach to the problem a year or two ago. And then Ukraine itself did finally sign into, well, this is older news. Zelensky signed into law a rule change reducing the age of eligibility for mobilization from 27 to 25. So basically the draft age has been lowered. So no surprise there, they need more manpower. So that was probably inevitable. But it took a long time to do it. The Ukrainian government has been very wary of fatigue in the country regarding the war, as well as skepticism that the war effort is going well. Skepticism about the overall war effort. So as a result, the Ukrainian government over the past 6 months has been a bit gun shy, not only about this change, but about major new mobilization in general. They do need more manpower, but the Ukrainian government has been dragging its feet for some time about a new draft to bring in new manpower. And supposedly that's because Zelensky himself, among perhaps other people, don't know that there will be a positive response to that amongst the public. That may well be the case, but I would point out, too, that part of the reason is probably that they don't have the confidence that they'll have the resources to fund and equip all of the people that they could get through a new mobilization. In that sense, the delay in aid from the United States and, mostly from the United States, probably acted as a disincentive there, because there's not much point in mobilizing people if you don't have the guns, ammunition, and equipment necessary to make them combat effective. But political reasons are also at play here. There is concern in the body politic in Ukraine about the course of the war. And so the government doesn't want to put too much pressure on the broader public in the form of a new draft that could antagonize them and create further pushback than what they've already seen. I'm not entirely sure that's a good idea. Even if there is pushback, it probably makes more sense to have a draft anyway. It's either an existential struggle for survival or it's not. If it's an existential struggle, you need to be pulling out all the stops. And if that involves incurring some unpopularity on the part of the public, then that's what you got to do. So be it.
Yeah.
And granted, I'm a fat guy in Dallas who has no stakes, so, not really for me to say so one way or the other. But just as a passive observer, given that there is a manpower shortage in the Ukrainian army, I would think it would have been much smarter just to have the draft, or maybe a somewhat truncated draft at least, and then deal with the consequences later, rather than just kind of hedging and delaying things for several months, trying to find some kind of alternative solution or something. That seems like very weird decision-making to me. So we usually have people from Russia and Ukraine who argue in chat when we talk about Ukraine. So maybe they can elaborate on that issue for me. I would certainly be interested in hearing other opinions, especially more informed ones. But I did find that a bit strange and confusing. But they have done it, and they even more recently, in the past week, I think, signed into law a new mobilization. So they are going to do that. It's not going to be as big as they wanted. And there was apparently something like 2,000 amendments that were made to the bill in Ukraine's parliament. So I'm not sure what kinds of amendments that would involve. That's a little suspicious, but we'll see. We'll see how it all pans out. At the very least, it is finally happening. So that does offer some relief. So between the mobilization and the passage of the aid bill in America's Congress, there is some reason for optimism going forward, because there had been growing talk about Ukraine being unprepared for the upcoming Russian offensive in the summer, possibly spring, and that they could lose the war this year if they did not eventually get some reinforcements, both in the form of new manpower and new aid. So that seems to be on the horizon now. So if there is going to be a Russian offensive, it seems Ukraine will be at least somewhat prepared for it. and that it need not necessarily be the beginning of the end for the Ukraine's war effort.
How many years do you say you think it'll be, ballpark, for the Ukraine war?
I would guess 10. Because at the very least, it's going to go through the end of this year to see how the presidential election shakes out.
Yeah.
So what? That'll be the war's third year, 22, 23, 24. And I think whatever happens with the presidential election in the United States, the war will go through 2025. You know, even if Trump is elected, I think Ukraine will try to hang on. It may be a losing effort, but I think they'll try to hang on as best they can for another year after that, at least. So they'll take the war through 2025, which would be the fourth year. And depending on how things go, I think, if I had to guess, that aid to Ukraine will continue. And so I think that'll prolong the war. I think Russia's strategy of attrition, where they try to wear out the West and test the resolve of Western polities to continue support to Ukraine, will continue. And I think Vladimir Putin's government's resolve on that count is going to be pretty resilient. So I think they would plan for like 5 to 6 years, at least. So that would take us through what? 2025 would be the fourth year. So 2026 would be the sixth year. And I think at that point, the Russian government might start considering negotiations. But after that, I think they would still drag it out to try to get as good a negotiating position as possible. So, you know, all told, even if fighting starts to peter out after the halfway point, like the fifth or sixth year, there will probably still be a lot of negotiations corresponding with activity at the front for another couple of years. Kind of Korean War style, basically. You know, the Korean War basically ended in the first year, but there was a lot of jockeying for position that happened for several years after that while the peace negotiations happened. So yeah, all told, by the time there's a peace treaty and the fighting actually fully stops, it'll probably be around 10 years, I would guess. But it could easily end before that, depending on circumstances in Ukraine or Russia. Like if aid to Ukraine gets cut off, there could be problems for Ukraine there that'll obviously very much shorten their war effort. Problems in Russia could emerge that cause them to try to seek an early exit from the war. You know, so really, it could be as little as like months, right? It could be over like 6 months from now. You know, it could be the presidential election happens and then everybody's like, okay, we know what's going to happen, so let's negotiate. But you know, again, I don't think that's going to be the case. I think Russia wants to wear out the West. I think, despite all of the hemming and hawing in the West, that support to Ukraine will continue, and so ultimately, it'll be a battle of attrition that lasts for several years, and then there will be protracted negotiations for several years after. So yeah, I would go for not longer than 10 years, but like something around 10 years. Let's say like 7 to 10, ballpark. I'm not an expert in this. I have no idea. That's the real answer. But my guess is that it's going to be a long war. You know, I would not hold my breath.
Makes sense. Yeah, war of attrition is definitely a muddier win condition than just a conventional, like, whose army can beat whose in a simple series of thrusts. They're really just like lobbing stuff at each other over the longer term. And someone will run out first.
Yeah. We'll see. We'll see. It's very much a battle of wills right now. Western will in particular is in question. But if we can resolve that to some degree, that would go a long way towards putting Ukraine on track for an eventual win. You know, again, given that Russia's strategy is one of just waiting out the West, that means that the Western response pretty much has to be either to just say, okay, we're not willing to stick this out as long as Russia, so let's quit, or we can say, we will stick this out as long as Russia does, just to show that we can, to deter them from future such aggression. You know, maybe there will be future Russian aggression regardless, but at the very least there won't be, because they don't think the West will be able to withstand some long, protracted conflict that will drain their resources. You know, proving that the West can do that is a valuable strategic objective. That's not to say there's not room for political debate about whether the objective is worth it in the end run, but certainly there is something valuable to be achieved by doing so. And I think ultimately the people who want to support Ukraine will be able to win that debate, even if it looks a little shaky right now. And I could be totally wrong about that. Let's be clear. Everything is very unclear at this point. But if I had to guess, I would say that Ukraine kind of has the pro-Ukraine crowd kind of has the inside track. And that things might cool off a bit, especially after the presidential election here in the United States. Because then the stakes are sort of less pressing. You know, there's less of a reason to make it an issue. But we'll see. Yeah, I don't know if I said so at the beginning of the war in Ukraine, but if I didn't, I should have. You know, there's going to be lots of twists and turns to the war. So there's going to be times when it looks like Ukraine is winning, and there's going to be times when Russia looks like it's winning. But, you know, most likely there's not going to be like a decisive move for some time. You know, most likely you're just going to have to ride the roller coaster for a while. And then eventually there will emerge in the long term some general trend towards the eventual outcome. But, you know, the people saying in 22 and 23 that, you know, Ukraine's going to win and it's just a matter of time, you know, those people were always wrong. Mm-hmm. And the people saying now that, you know, Russia's going to win and Ukraine is screwed, they're also wrong for the same reason. Like, these are just short-term trends in the conflict. Like, there's more to come, for sure, one way or the other. So, you know, I would not place bets yet. It's still very much It's still very much up in the air.
Yeah, it was interesting seeing that conflict still has, I think, the highest death toll of anything that's currently going on in the world.
Anything that's currently going on, yeah. That war in Tigray in Ethiopia actually surpassed it. But that war has since concluded. So they're not gaining numbers like Ukraine continues to do. Mm-hmm. So, you know, the conflict in Ukraine may yet surpass the Tigray war. Mm-hmm. We'll see. I suspect if it goes as long as I think it might, you know, if it does actually go for 10 years, then it almost certainly will. It's going to be a very large casualty total when all is said and done, I imagine. Well, how are we doing on time?
We got another 20 minutes.
All right. Let's see. Did you see the solar eclipse? No, you were in LA.
We saw the sky get slightly more dim, but yeah, we didn't see much.
Okay.
Could you see it?
Yeah, actually, I could.
Nice.
I even went outside of my cave to take a gander at it.
Nice. Was it spooky and apocalyptic? Did it make you quake in your boots?
I would not say it was apocalyptic, but I was genuinely surprised by how dark it got. You know, maybe I shouldn't have been, but I was expecting it to get like somewhat darker, kind of like dusk. Mm-hmm. And at first, that's kind of what it looked like. But then when it reached the full eclipse, that's when it really got dark. So I was pretty impressed.
Nice.
You know, everybody's lights on the street came on. Like it really did look like, you know, kind of very, very late dusk.
Interesting.
What surprised me more than that, though, was how quickly it got bright again. You know, when the full eclipse ended, it was like a light switch. It was like bam, It just came right back. Do I have your phone number?
Yes, that's how we usually coordinate the time we start.
Oh.
I texted you earlier and you said yes.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I get so many like alerts from like Gmail and all these other, and WeChat, you know, these other applications. I forget sometimes that, yes, some of them do actually arrive corresponding to phone number. Mm-hmm. Okay. So I took a video. I'll send it to you. It's not the most exciting video, and it's got terrible plant commentary. What else was going on? Well, the world didn't end. I know some people were saying that it was going to be the apocalypse.
Yeah, I think it was a rapture of some kind. I'm not sure. I couldn't really get a hard answer of which group believed that it was actually going to be wrapping up at that point.
Yeah.
But congrats to everyone. You survived another apocalypse.
Yeah, yet another one.
Yeah.
Yeah, if it was a rapture, that doesn't really say much for humanity.
Didn't really get many of us.
No. Let's see, what else was going on? Oh, yeah. Did you hear the bad news, Neuro, about Phoenix?
Phoenix, Arizona?
Yeah.
What happened?
Oh, they tragically lost their hockey team.
Oh, no.
Yeah. Yeah, it's probably been in the cards for a while, but still sad. They were there for like 25, 27 years, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And, even if Phoenix isn't a hockey market, there were a lot of people that loved the team. So, yeah, it's very disappointing for them. So,
What was their team again?
The Arizona Coyotes.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Yeah. I still think it's weird to call them Arizona Coyotes, though, because I grew up calling them the Phoenix Coyotes. They changed their name like 5 years ago or something like that.
Yeah, I would have heard the Phoenix Coyotes better. That's what they were back during the Stars heyday.
Yeah. We played them a lot. We were in the same division for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, kind of sad to see him go. But, given all of the trouble with the new arena and the money, it's probably inevitable.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they were playing in an arena with 5,000 seats, I think, last year. Very small. Supposed to be a temporary measure, but it wasn't looking very temporary by the end. So they finally decided to pull the trigger and let the team leave.
Were they not filling the 5,000 seats?
I don't actually know. I hadn't been keeping track of it. But even if they had, that's nothing. A modern arena needs like 20,000 thereabouts. 5,000 is like a small college arena or something like that.
Right.
Not befitting a pro team, which is what they were supposed to be.
I would think the Arizonians would be very happy to just be in a cool place. I think it's one of the hotter cities.
Yeah, very much so. Very much so.
They couldn't keep up with the intense refrigeration costs. No, hockey's a pretty cool sport. I really like watching it. There's a part of me used to feel like hockey is like, it's a classy sport. Like it's a little bit more civilized. And then I was reading about this tradition of it's the Detroit Red Wings. There's a dude who randomly, because it required like 8 wins for them to make the playoffs or something ridiculous like this, and there was a low chance for them to do it. This guy threw a dead octopus out onto the ice to represent the 8 wins that they needed, and then it ended up boosting the seafood sales of like whichever fishmonger they got this octopus from, and it's been a tradition for like 30 to 40 years. And I found out about this from the animal rights people who were like, why do they need to throw the octopus on the ice? And I was like, man, maybe hockey isn't that civilized. It's pretty crazy. I thought it would have been the Kraken or something, because at least they're a sea creature.
No, I think they did eventually ban that in Detroit.
Yeah, they did.
Which the fans were not very happy about.
Yeah, but the octopuses were very happy about it.
I'm sure. Well, do you know where the Coyotes are moving?
Where?
Salt Lake City.
Ah.
Yeah. The guy who owns the basketball team there bought them. Wanted them there. Apparently, he's been trying to get more pro sports teams into Salt Lake City.
Mm-hmm.
So this is his latest victory.
Interesting. Yeah, I wouldn't have normally thought to buy a sports team if I ever became rich, but you could. It would make it exciting, I guess. That's a more exciting investment than like watching real estate prices go up and down.
Yeah, it's fun. Kind of pays for itself if you run it right. Something to do.
Mm-hmm.
When your team wins the championship, it feels good.
Yeah. For sure. Chat, what's your favorite sport? I think to watch mine has been hockey. Definitely enjoyed watching the Brett Hull, Mike Modano, Joe Nieuwendyk, Darian Hatcher era of Dallas Stars. Getting to see your team go from being like pretty shitty and like, hey, we get to go see a hockey team lose, to like, hey, our hockey team is actually out of control this year and they might win everything. And it's like, wait, what? Really? Yeah. They're extremely strong.
Yeah, those were the good old days, Neuro.
Yeah. How are they now?
Actually, this season they did really good. I haven't really followed them closely for a couple of years now, but I think they were number one in the Western Conference this year. Yeah, so yeah, they've recovered pretty significantly from the bad old days of the 2010s.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they did not do well in the wake of Bill. What was his name? Bill Hicks? Tom Hicks? I think his name was. I forget. He was the guy who owned the team through the 90s after they moved from Minnesota.
Uh-huh.
And he declared bankruptcy in like 2010, 2011, something like that. And so the team ended up getting owned by a bank. And the bank did not give a shit. They didn't want to spend any money. Their whole approach to managing the team was bare minimum. Whatever the minimum salary cap is, that's how much money they wanted to spend on players. And they did that year after year. Man, they lost some good players because of that too. Yeah, they had Brad Richards for a while, and he wanted to stay with the team, but they ended up letting him go because they couldn't afford him. I mean, they could have afforded him, but the bank just didn't want to spend the money. So they just had to let him walk for nothing. Mm-hmm. They gave up Brad Richards for nothing, Neuro. Oh, no. That was distressing. So the team was bad for a long time until they finally got the new owner, and he was able to start turning it around. But, it just takes a long time to turn a team around, right? That's like a 10-year commitment.
Yeah.
But, the investments that they made are finally starting to pay off, so they're actually pretty competitive now. But, yeah, the 90s were definitely the golden age.
Yep.
Those were the good times.
Those are the only names I recognize, too. So, like, for current hockey players and stuff, I don't know shit about it. I've heard there's less fighting now than there used to be back then.
Yeah, they kind of moved away from that. Mm-hmm. I mean, it makes sense. You don't want people getting injured. You do kind of want to focus on the skill side of the game and whatnot. Mm-hmm. The fighting was a part of the game. It's a part of the culture, but it's also kind of gimmicky. Mm-hmm. And I think the NHL wanted to improve the image of the league to make it seem a little more professional and a little more accessible. So, people have mixed feelings about it, but that's the direction they've chosen. It seems to be working. There's still some fighting, but it's not like the bench clearing brawl days from way back when. That doesn't really happen anymore.
The whole team's run out and it's just a big shit fight.
Yeah.
Well, I guess they probably field less players who are good at fighting then. So then the average hockey player has probably shifted somewhat. Because I think I remember used to have enforcers that you would draft who, they could kind of stay on their ice skates and stuff, but boy, could they beat the shit out of people. So if you had any of your guys getting picked on, you would just send a big dude at them, and maybe they couldn't hit the broadside of a barn with the puck, but they could tell the team what's what, tell the other team.
Yeah, that's exactly what happened. A lot of the goons, the guys that were there mostly just for intimidation, to the enforcers, as you say, they've kind of disappeared. There's probably still some, but for the most part, they've been phased out. And the players in general now are much younger. Part of that is because of the salary cap. The younger players are just cheaper, so they're more affordable, more efficient. But also, they want to focus more on skill, because of the shift away from, the sort of goon style of hockey. And younger players, they kind of, well, I guess you could have young goons too, but part of the reason for the shift in young players is that they tend to be more the skill sort, or at least that's how they've been drafting. So yeah, there's definitely been a profile shift in terms of the players in the league. They tend to be younger and they tend to be more about skill rather than, toughness. It used to be the best players were the players who could balance toughness with skill, but you don't really need that as much now. So it's definitely more of a finesse game, almost more European, you could say.
Yeah.
European hockey has always been very much focused on skill and finesse over the more physical side of the game. That was one of the reasons it was hilarious when the Soviet national team had the Summit Series with Canada back in the 1970s. Yeah, those two teams had very different approaches to the game.
Canada was more aggressive?
Yeah, Canada was more physically aggressive, right? The Soviet team was very aggressive in terms of just offense, but they weren't very physical. They were all about, passing, making plays, that kind of stuff. And they could make some really cool plays. They were very good at that. But they were not prepared for the degree to which the Canadian team punished them physically. Yeah, the Soviets kind of had the better of it for most of the series, but the Canadians were were able to eke things out. I think it ended up being a tie. Like the Soviets won 2, the Canadians won 2, and then there was actually a tie game. So I think it was a pretty even series overall. Yeah, I don't think Americans know much about the Summit series, but if you talk to Canadians about it, they are very, very aware of the Summit series. That was a big deal in Canada when it happened.
So that was a big win for them, I'm guessing?
Yeah, I mean, in so much as a tied series is a big win. They didn't lose. It was especially notable, too, because at that time, professional hockey players did not play in the Olympics. Because only amateurs, quote unquote, were supposed to be playing in the Olympics. And the Soviets said that all of their, players were amateurs, but, obviously they were not, and they had all of their best guys there. But all of the best guys in North America were playing in the NHL, and because they were, quote unquote, professionals, they were not eligible. But they were totally eligible for the Summit Series. So that was sort of the first time people had seen an actual competition between the best players in the Soviet Union and the best players in Canada. It's pretty wild stuff. Yeah. I think the captain of Team Canada was ejected because he pretty much purposely injured the captain of the Soviet national team.
Wow.
Yeah, Bobby Clark was his name. Well-known guy. Slashed the captain of the Soviet national team. Broke his arm, I think?
Jeez.
Something to that effect. Yeah, pretty dramatic stuff. Canadian team, easily the more violent of the teams.
Yeah. There's no way we can get past their goalie. He's too good. What should we do? I don't know. Start hitting them. Are we the baddies? Yeah. Absolutely the baddies.
Yeah, certainly the Soviet national team thought so. They were not really prepared for that. They did not really consider it like a particularly civilized way to play the game.
Yeah. The violence first approach.
Yeah, do you remember Sergei Zubov?
Yes. He was a defenseman on the Seahawks. Or it's not the Seahawks, the Stars, sorry.
Yeah, he grew up in the Soviet Union, and he was actually trained by the Soviet hockey program. Huh. So his style of play was very Soviet.
Yeah. I remember him being more finessed for sure.
Oh, yeah. He was really good at that. Just great skater, great passer. He stood out from the crowd, very much so. And that was very much a legacy of that sort of Soviet approach.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Miss watching him play. He was a fun guy. He was a fun guy to watch.
I think he played until he was pretty old as well.
Yeah, of all the guys in the original defensive corps from back in the day, he was the one that stayed the longest.
Mm-hmm. Easily.
Because I think Matvechuk left pretty early, like 2003. They traded him as part of that Joe Nieuwendyk deal.
Mm-hmm.
Or was he a free agent? I actually don't remember. Maybe he left as a free agent and signed with New Jersey and ended up playing with Joe Nieuwendyk. Well, regardless, he was gone like 2003. I think Hatcher stuck around another year or so, but then they ended up letting him walk because the game was kind of getting faster and he was more of a defensive defenseman, obviously. If you know anything about Darian Hatcher, he was like just a really big guy who was good at defensive hockey, but he wasn't known for scoring at all.
Mm-hmm.
So they actually let him walk, which really shocked me because he'd been the captain of the team for a long time.
Yeah.
He was a solid dude, but nope, let him walk, and he ended up signing with Detroit, of all places. Outrageous, right?
To the villains! That's like our main enemy. Jeez.
Yeah, I love how one-sided that rivalry is, because I don't think anybody in Detroit gives a shit about the Dallas Stars.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, we're down here just hating them. It's like, oh, those guys, we have to beat them.
Yep.
Yeah, Zubov lasted the longest, and then Sidor was the second longest.
Mm-hmm.
We held on to him for a while longer. I think we actually ended up trading him away and he was gone for a couple years, and then they actually traded to get him back for a while. And then I think he retired.
So Zubov was born in 1970, and his last season of hockey was 2008.
Yep.
Wow. So he was getting up there in years for being a professional athlete, for playing at the highest level. Impressive.
Yeah, the skill players play for longer, because if you play a really physical game, it wears you down, and you end up having to quit sooner.
Mm-hmm.
But for the more finesse guys, they don't have as much of a problem in that regard.
Mm-hmm.
So like Mike Modano was able to play for a long, long time. But Brendan Morrow, he kind of got worn down.
Yeah, he was a bigger dude.
Yeah, so he ended up retiring a little bit sooner.
Yeah, Mike
It was sad
Modano
to see him
retired
go.
in 2010.
Yeah.
He started in 1989. Damn.
They actually let him walk and signed with Detroit.
Him as well?
Yeah, there was a disagreement over money, and so he did technically play like one season.
Yeah,
playing
2010.
for Detroit.
Wow.
Also absolutely outrageous. But they did symbolically sign him so that he could retire as a star.
Mm-hmm.
So, that was a nice little symbolic move to do. But still, the fact that they let him go at all was just crazy. Imagine Mike Modano in a Red Wing uniform. Just disgusting.
Yeah. It feels like it feels like an American soldier hero who's like wearing Soviet armor or something like that. Just it's even the same colors too. They're red. It's like, don't you know that red is bad? This is all part of indoctrination, chat. Everyone gets indoctrinated in things. You could be indoctrinated for your country or for your sports team. Agent Smith and I are nerding out a little bit here because we were indoctrinated that the Dallas Stars are God's chosen team of hockey, and the Red Wings are the Devils team. The New Jersey Devils, they're not in our division, so we don't really care about them as much, even though their mascot is the devil. But yeah, fun sport. I have fond memories of like getting those personal pizzas with my dad. You have one of those. I can't remember. It's like Red Baron or something, but it's a small little box, and you get a pizza there. And we were sharing season tickets with some other people from his work, which is cool. But yeah, sports.
Yeah, I'm sure it's all very exciting to the people who came here for the world discussion.
It's all good. I think it keeps us authentic. If we're too stuffy all the time, it can be too serious. So we have fun things that we talk about too. Yesterday I did a fun thing that was not the most highbrow intellectual story, but we watched Godzilla, King of Monsters.
Oh, the original. Did you watch the American version or the Japanese version?
The American version, I think.
Ah, okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but huge fights of monsters is pretty cool. It was funny seeing it when we pulled it up. It was like the critic rating for the movie was 42%, and then the audience rating was 82%. So the stuffy critics were like, there's no story to this, it's shit. And the fans were like, yeah, Godzilla!
Wait, is there more than one King of the Monsters now? What year was it released? Oh, okay. Never mind. I was totally thinking of a different movie.
You're thinking of the 1956?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, this is the 2019.
Gotcha. Yeah, the American release of the original, the first Godzilla movie, was called Godzilla, King of the Monsters. So I was all excited that you watched it. I was like, oh, cool, Neuro's getting into Godzilla. Yeah, okay, Godzilla King, the American one released a couple years ago. Fair enough.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's okay, as I recall. Did you like it?
Yeah. Godzilla's very cool. It's interesting that he's a hero in this one, because he's a villain in a lot of stuff, but I think he's also considered a force of nature who's like striving for some kind of balance, so he will sometimes be protecting humans and fighting on their behalf. So, yeah, it's really cool.
The American Godzilla movies being made by Legend are very much a callback to the Showa series of Godzilla films, which were those were the Godzilla movies made in the 1960s and 70s. And especially in the case of the 70s movies, they were just increasingly ridiculous. So, if you look at the first Legends Godzilla movie, that was kind of a callback to more of the 60s ones, which were kind of semi-serious. And then with each progressive new Godzilla movie from Legend, they become more and more like the 70s movies. So, by the time you get to Kong versus Godzilla, it's just all camp. It's just completely ridiculous. It's fantastic stuff. If you grew up watching 70s Godzilla movies like I did, Kong versus Godzilla is a very fun movie. There's a lot of references. Yeah, definitely check that out if you haven't already.
Kong versus Godzilla is different from the new one, Godzilla X Kong?
Yeah, different movie.
Okay.
Yeah, Godzilla Kong X Kong just came out like a couple weeks ago.
Yeah.
Yeah, Godzilla versus Kong is like 2 years ago, 3 years ago, something like that. But if you actually want to watch a movie, if you want to watch an actual movie involving Godzilla, definitely give the first one a try, 1956. Make sure it's the Japanese version, though. Because that movie, the Japanese version is, in fact, a totally self-contained movie that tells the story. The American version kind of cuts it up in a weird way that really undermines the story arc. There's barely much of a story in the American version to speak of. But the Japanese version, maintains it in its original glory. I don't want to oversell it. It's not like the highest cinema you'll ever see, but it is a pretty good movie in its own right. Much more so than most Godzilla movies.
Which one was this you're talking about?
It was just called Godzilla, or if you like, Gojira, the original Japanese name. It was released in 1956.
Oh, the original one, nice.
Yeah.
The original one, Fuzzy Court is saying, is an anti-nuclear war film.
Very much so. Yeah, there's a lot of references to nuclear testing and Japan's history with radiation and nuclear weapons. Have you ever heard of the Lucky Dragon?
No.
So the Lucky Dragon was a Japanese fishing boat that was exposed to radiation as a result of nuclear testing in the Pacific. And it became kind of a minor scandal in Japan. They came back, they were very sick. People didn't really know why. Radiation sickness was kind of a new thing at the time. Scientists were familiar with it, but the general public much less so. So the fact that these Japanese fishermen had gotten out and gotten sick because of nuclear weapons kind of reminded everybody of the war, because obviously Japan had been nuked during the war and suffered grievously. So, there was a strong anti-nuclear sentiment in Japan, both because of the war and because of the Lucky Dragon incident. And that's actually referenced in the first Godzilla movie, because they have a boat full of fishermen who get sick because of radiation. They don't know why. So
in the movie, did they call the boat the Unlucky Dragon?
No, they do not.
They should have.
They do not. But yeah, there's definitely a strong anti-nuclear theme there in the movie that kind of goes on throughout. But it's more than just anti-nuclear. It's also just kind of anti-war, because there's a lot of sequences in the movie that drive home the destruction of Godzilla. And, watching it today, it's like, wow, they're really focusing a lot on all the destruction. I wonder why. But if you were a Japanese viewer in the 1950s, that would have immediately reminded you of World War II.
Yeah.
So it was very much a callback to that. And so in that sense, it's actually a very bold movie, because, reminding everybody of the most catastrophic event in their lives in a movie that is meant for entertainment is always a pretty bold choice,
for sure.
Creatively speaking. So you have to give them a lot of credit for that. But even if you're not, a Japanese citizen in the 1950s watching it for the first time, it's still a very good take on the anti-war genre, so to speak. It really drives home the suffering, the destruction, etc., in a compelling way. Yeah, the worst thing I think you could say about it is that it drags a little bit at times. Again, it's not like an Oscar-worthy movie, but as far as achieving what it sets out to do, it definitely does so. It definitely sticks the landing, I would argue.
Well, it sounds like it works on the story more so than a lot of the more recent ones that are more just about the monster fights.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Godzilla 56 is probably one of only a handful of Godzilla movies that really invests a lot into writing a decent story. You know, like you say, most of the other ones kind of are just excuses to watch Godzilla wrestle WWE style with other monsters of one kind or another. Which I don't have a problem with. You know, again, I grew up with that. I find it immensely entertaining. Perhaps that speaks to my poor taste in movies, but it doesn't bother me. But yeah, as far as like actual movies go, probably Godzilla 56, Godzilla 84, and Shin Godzilla. And Godzilla -1 I've heard very good things about, but I can't really recommend it because I haven't seen it yet.
Yeah, chat's talking about it right now. They're saying it's really good.
Yeah, supposedly that's one of the best. I was talking to a guy yesterday who was saying that it's the best Godzilla movie. So quite a bold statement, so I'm very eager to give it a try whenever it is released online, you know, on some kind of Netflix or other streaming service. But those are all pretty solid watches if you just like movies and good stories, not just Godzilla per se. It's a pretty short bench after that. It's not a lot I would be comfortable recommending to people who are not already fans of Godzilla.
I saw a video, I think it was a TikTok that Trisha may have showed me, but it was a guy who was breaking down the different breaths and laser beams of the different Godzillas and rating how powerful and also how cool looking they were. And he made a tier list with all of these. And he knew every single Godzilla movie. He was like, yeah, this movie, it was really solid, really true to form. This movie was really shit. I have no idea what they're doing.
You know, yeah, I can already imagine what it would have looked like.
Yep. Now I want to watch Godzilla -1. Where is this streaming? This got an 8.3 on IMDb, which is pretty high.
I don't think anybody's streaming it yet. They've got some kind of agreement that's delaying it while the American Godzilla movie is coming out. Kong X Godzilla, you know, that's come out recently, so they don't want to compete for eyeballs.
Yeah.
So you might have to wait a while for it. Yeah, if you're not interested in good movies, you just want a fun movie that involves Godzilla, and one that does not require you to be a pre-existing Godzilla fan, there's a couple there. One would be Godzilla versus King Ghidorah, which I think was 93. I don't quite remember exactly. It was like early 90s. Godzilla versus King Ghidorah is an absolutely batshit insane movie. And given that this is Godzilla, this is really saying something, because there's some really crazy Godzilla movies, but Godzilla versus King Ghidorah is one of the craziest. Because it involves like time travel, and it's got Mecha King Ghidorah in it, and it's totally fucking bonkers. Did you know that 50 years in the future, Neuro, that Japan buys Africa?
Really?
Yeah. Japan is a superpower. Pretty incredible stuff, right?
Yeah.
You can look forward to that and many other very delicious tidbits if you watch Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah.
That purchase will seem relatively tame compared to the other crazy stuff that happens.
Oh yeah. So that's definitely a recommend if you just want a fun, weird one. King Kong versus Godzilla is another one. The original one from way back in the day. Preferably the Japanese version. You know, the American version kind of just makes it a straight monster fight, but the Japanese version has lots of little references and jokes kind of picking at capitalism, weirdly enough. You know, just kind of little jabs here and there criticizing commercialism, capitalism, etc. You know, they kind of do it in a fun way. You know, the original Japanese version was much more campy than the American version that was released later, which I think is unfortunate, but, you know, American studios do not have a high opinion of American audiences, so they very frequently butcher stuff from Japan like that, especially back in the day. And of course, if you like Mystery Science Theater 3000, they very famously did both Godzilla vs. Gigan and Godzilla vs. Megalon. So those can be fun, especially if you're watching the MST episodes corresponding to them. Yeah, Godzilla vs. Megalon is especially crazy because that involves underwater civilization. I think it was Atlantis. I don't quite remember. But they summon a giant beetle to fight for them, and then Godzilla ends up teaming up with a giant robot, and then Gigan shows up for some reason. So it's a 2v2, and it just turns into wrestling, basically. Fantastic stuff.
Giant lizard, is he a protector? Is he a threat? Find out on, well, it depends on which Godzilla movie you're talking about.
Oh yeah, yeah. A lot of variants in that regard.
Very cool looking monster, though. Definitely respect it. In Godzilla King of Monsters, he fights Gamora, or whatever his name is. Ghidorah.
Yeah, King Ghidorah.
Yeah.
One and the same.
Three-headed lightning-spitting dragon.
Classic Godzilla villain.
Yeah. Pretty tough. It was interesting. The story probably doesn't matter for people. So in King of Monsters, basically, it turns out that there's a scientist who thinks that more of these titans should be released. A lot of them are like frozen or something by this organization called Monarch. And one of them busts out King Ghidorah, and that one apparently is from another planet. So it's alien to Earth's biosphere, and it was calling all of the other titans to respect it as the alpha of the titans. And formerly this was Godzilla's domain, but Godzilla and King Ghidorah had fought many times in the past on Earth. Yeah.
That's the one.
Yep.
Yeah, that's almost a soft remake of Godzilla versus Astro Monster, which has a somewhat similar plot.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting that the humans have to help Godzilla in some ways, because Ghidorah sways some of the other titans to fight for it, and then Mothra is the main ally to Godzilla.
As always.
Mm-hmm.
When he isn't trying to kill her, anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Mothra has a very specific sequence of events that she always follows in every Godzilla movie. You know, if you know, you know.
Mm-hmm.
No spoilers, in so much as anybody cares about spoiling a Godzilla movie. But yeah, if you're familiar with Mothra's experience in Godzilla movies, it's pretty much just the same thing over and over again.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't mean to divert us quite so much, so if you want to go to bed, feel free.
Yeah, we're enjoying some Godzilla wrap-up here. Chat's asking if you've ever visited any of the Southeast Asian countries.
Thailand, yeah. Cool. I was part of that trip I went on in 2019.
Cool.
I was in Bangkok for a week, and then I was in Phuket for a week. Yeah. Very cool place. I really liked it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead.
A friend of mine, Naven, he was born in Thailand, I think. In any case, it's basically a first language to him speaking Thai. So if I did go over there, that would be nice to have a guide where they can get you the good deals and everything and talk to everybody.
Yeah, everything was very cheap.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent food. Very affordable and very tasty. Loved the pad Thai.
Yeah.
You know what I really loved was the Thai milk tea. That was awesome.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I still miss that stuff.
Yeah, we got boba like 2 days ago, and Trisha always gets the Thai tea, or most of the time. Thai tea has a really unique and good flavor.
Yeah, very solid.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we walked around, saw a lot of the sites, you know, the temples and whatnot, and the center, the old city of Bangkok. We actually had a hotel that was in the old city, weirdly enough. I didn't realize how weird that was until we got there, and it became apparent that like everybody else was taking buses from their hotels outside of the old city, and we were pretty much the only ones just like walking around from place to place, because our hotel was just so close it made sense to walk.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, we got a lot of exercise as a result, which was perhaps not the move given how hot it was. Yeah, you take multiple showers a day in Thailand.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, if you're a tourist on a bus, you don't have to worry about it so much because the buses are mostly air conditioned. But we got the authentic Thai experience, so we sweated our balls off while we were there.
Mm-hmm.
Had to change our clothes quite a bit.
Yeah, that's one of the theories for why spicy food is common around the equator in places like India and Thailand, is it's a natural preservative of food. Because it's warmer and more humid, there are often more like bugs and bacteria and mold that would grow on stuff. But if you spice it up, the bugs say, ouchie, wow, no thank you. So nice way to store stuff. And then I think just having food that makes you sweat is another way to naturally cool off that doesn't expend as much energy as like exercising or something. Yeah, spicy food is very good. I like Thai food a lot. It's cool that you can customize your curry dishes and stuff with different sauces and different veggies and proteins and so on. You get to choose the spice level, brown rice or white rice, what your protein is, what the veggies are, and what the curry is. Always a good time. I like musaman curry. It's like a potato and peanut curry is really good. And I'll have a Penang. It's another pretty common Thai one. We had the funniest thing. There was a restaurant in Dallas that we used to go to when we were at UTD, and we would go with Navin, and he would say some Thai to us, or to the restaurant people, and they brought out a separate set of menus that were like $5 a plate cheaper, but it was all in Thai.
Yep.
It's like the secret code.
That's how it goes.
And it was definitely more authentic and weird. Nothing that an American customer would feel comfortable ordering, probably.
Yeah, I suspect that's true, unfortunately.
Yep.
Yeah, great dishes out there in Thailand.
Mm-hmm.
And Phuket was very nice, too, while I was there. Very nice beaches. I'm not a beach person, but I gathered that it was nice.
Mm-hmm.
I was with my sister, and she confirmed that, yes, this is indeed a nice beach. So in so much as she's an authority, we can infer.
Good. There's one final question we can wrap up with. Chat's asking, what's the reason for U.S. to be involved in South American lithium zone as stated by Laura Richardson?
Laura Richardson.
South America lithium zone.
Yeah, South America has some lithium. Australia has a lot more. But South America does have some. I mean, the obvious reason is because lithium is going to be an important resource for things like electric vehicles, which are going to be important for the energy transition. Beyond that, it's not really a strategic resource per se. So, I guess in so much as you see it, the degree to which you see lithium as a strategic resource is going to depend on how important you think the energy transition is to the United States. And that, of course, is going to vary pretty considerably from person to person. You could make the argument that even if you don't think the energy transition is important, you could argue that the auto industry is shifting more towards electric vehicles regardless of the energy transition. And that in so much as that's the case, it's important for the American auto industry to be able to have access to the resources that will be necessary for them to compete on that market. So in so much as electric vehicles will require lots of lithium, which they will, because that's a core component for a lot of batteries, then securing those resources will be important to ensuring that American automakers are not just undermined and eventually just destroyed by Chinese competition. And it's Chinese competition that they're mostly thinking about, because they're already pretty far ahead in terms of the development of electric vehicles. So securing the lithium could be considered important to securing the future of the American auto industry, and securing the future of the American auto industry could be argued to be an important strategic goal to ensure the maintenance of the overall industrial base of the United States. But whether or not Chinese EVs are really a threat to the American auto industry is pretty debatable, and whether or not the best way to secure the American auto industry in the face of competition from China is by securing resources like lithium is pretty debatable. So I don't know that that's necessarily going to be true. But that's going to be the logic, basically. That's why some people could or would argue that the U.S. government should be more active in securing natural resources in places like South America. But if you're going to make that argument, then again, I would point out that Australia has a lot more lithium than South America does. So, at that point, it would be maybe the reason to secure lithium in South America would be to deny it to China, but I don't think that works either, because a lot of natural resources in Latin America are controlled by state-owned companies, and those companies are not going to respond well to foreign companies from the United States trying to buy them and then not develop them. They want to sell to whoever's buying. If China's buying a lot, that's who they're going to sell to. So, that's the reality. So I don't think there's really a lot of actual resource competition happening right now between China and the United States. A lot of people talk about it and are concerned about, what'll happen if this, that, or the other resource is, cut off because of Chinese control of that resource, or because of control of Chinese refining of that resource, which they actually have a much larger monopoly in. But it's largely hyperventilating at this point. There is some reason for concern. It's a good idea for the US government to try to hedge its bets and to try to mitigate dependence on Chinese producers, but trying to secure resources in South America is not going to be part and parcel of that. Certainly not lithium, of all things. Mm-hmm. If you're going to worry about access to resources, lithium and other materials, be they rare earths or other materials like lithium that are not rare earths but are critical, quote unquote, it would actually be much better to worry about the refining of those materials. Because if you look at where resources like lithium and rare earths and whatnot come from, there's actually a pretty diverse supply outside of China, to the point where it's not that likely that you'll be cut off from those resources if China decides to shut off exports of those resources to the United States or other like-minded countries. However, the big caveat is that China has a near monopoly on the refining of a lot of those materials, to the point where if they decided to cut off the export of refined versions of those materials, that actually could be very disruptive. So in so much as there should be an objective there, in so much as there's an objective to mitigate dependence on Chinese exporters, the focus should be a lot more on developing a capacity to refine scarce metals like lithium or rare earths metals of various sort. That would be much smarter. And there hasn't been as much of it. There is some work on that front, but it's delayed because of bureaucracy. So, there really should be much more urgency there, since there's certainly an impetus. But, Washington doesn't actually take competition with China all that seriously right now, as I've argued before. So, it's not that surprised that it's being dragged out as much as it is. But yeah, South America is not that important. It's refining and the capacity to refine materials like that is more important. So I would focus a lot more on that. Yeah, but anyway, like any talk about trying to, do resource competition with China and South America is probably exaggerated at this point. That's more about, I think, hypotheticals more than actual strategizing, because I can't think of a major strategic plan that would necessitate actual resource competition in South America with China. Certainly there's not a plan like that would actually be workable, given that there would be significant Latin American opposition to it. They want to sell, again, all of their natural resources to the highest bidder. And any attempt to stop them from doing that is going to meet resistance, not only from, it's going to meet resistance across the political spectrum. There's not going to be anybody in Latin America who seriously doesn't want to sell resources to China, given how important trade with China is to the economies in the region. So yeah, if you're worried about the United States, like overthrowing governments again, Cold War style, to secure lithium or whatever, I can understand the concern, but it's probably not going to be a thing. It doesn't make a lot of sense. It's not an urgent priority for Washington one way or the other. And even if it were, there's other ways that they could do it. And there's other priorities in terms of competition with China that would definitely take precedence.
It makes sense. Well, thank you, chat, for weighing in tonight during World Discussion, where we talked about US history, hockey, and Godzilla. That was good. I'll try to get more of American nations worked through.
Look forward to it.
Hell yeah. Well, chat, if we messed up anything during our discussion, please feel free to leave us a scathing review in the YouTube comments. Agent Smith will get to go through Twitch chat after this so he can read all of your lovely contributions to the chat. I give you your normally challenge of walk and push-ups, sir. And we will see you on the next episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith.
Yeah, thanks again. Always a privilege. Talk to you next time.
GG.